which has really thousands of people who gave their lives, not just as martyrs, but as all kinds of things in the history of this faith, is still somewhat secretive for the rest of the world, that they don't really know. So I think the people who are really going to want to know how it all happened probably aren't even born yet. So we're recording for the archives in the United States, and sometimes other archives pick up on it as well. And I send to any archives that are interested, as well as the speaker has copies of his own or her own presentation. And so tonight we are so lucky that Adib Masumian is coming to tell us about the Mahmoud's diary. The second chapter, so to speak, is about the European part. You know, it was translated into German before it was translated into English, which really surprised me at the time. Nonetheless, I was too lazy to read it in German, so I'll just keep to your English version, Adib. So without further ado, his book is for sale with George Ronald, right, Adib?
That's correct. It can also be purchased now, as of a few weeks ago, through the US Baha'i distribution service, which is Baha'iBookstore.com. And I see Anne Perry has got her copy. She's holding it up. So it'll arrive in a timely fashion if you buy it.
But us in Europe need it on Amazon DE because the shipping and customs into Europe is so expensive.
Yeah, I'm hoping that GR will be able to put it up for sale on Amazon as well soon. I don't have a timeline on that yet, but hopefully in the next couple months, who can say? But for the time being, it's just the publisher or USPDS. So fingers crossed.
What about
sometimes Baha'i Verlag, in the German Baha'i Verlag, also distributes. So if you look at Verlag, VERLAG.de, Baha'i Verlag, they will also have it. So Adib, this is your night. I will spotlight you. You can do what you want. I'm really looking forward to this. And thank you everybody for coming.
The pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Jennifer. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see here. Okay, you should be seeing my PowerPoint in editing mode. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go full screen on that. All right. So thank you again, Jennifer, for that very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with all of you today, or tonight, as the case may be, depending on where each of you is tuning in from. As was mentioned by Jennifer, I'm going to be talking to you about Abdu'l-Baha's second journey throughout Europe, as it was chronicled by one of his secretaries, Mirza Mahmud Zarghani. And I'm referring to this as Abdu'l-Baha's second journey because, as some of you may know, he had previously gone to Europe in 1911, but that journey is outside the scope of the chronicle covered in this presentation. I wanted to start by giving just a bit of background on the original chronicle and the history of its publication and translation, since this has been a source of confusion for some people. The chronicle was originally written in Persian and in 2 volumes. Pictured here is Volume 1, which covers Abdu'l-Baha's travels in America from April to December 1912. It was first published in Bombay in 1914, and then reprinted twice in Germany in the 1980s. In 1998, an English translation of it, which was done by the late Mohi Sobhani and his collaborator, the late Shirley Macias, was published by George Ronald, who then reprinted the book with a new cover in 2012. And just a quick clarifying note to say that apart from this new cover you see, the second printing of the translation is totally identical to the first printing, at least as far as I've been able to tell. And then we have Volume 2, which covers Abdu'l-Baha's subsequent travels throughout Europe, and which is the focus of this presentation. My translation of it was just published by George Ronald, and I also put together a supplement to it, which is freely available online. The supplement features transcripts of 200 talks or other verbal remarks by Abdu'l-Baha of various provenances and degrees of authenticity that align with the timeline of this volume, but which may not have been quoted in it. So in a sense, it's kind of meant to flesh out the words of Abdu'l-Baha that were recorded in the original volume. The supplement also contains my translations of 27 tablets from Abdu'l-Baha, or selections from them, regarding his journey to the West, and all of those translations were reviewed for accuracy at the Baha'i World Center. Additionally, it includes my translation of a fairly short biography of Mirza Mahmud Zarghani himself, who wrote the 2 volumes of the original chronicle, And in many cases, the full transcripts of the talk Zarghani mentions in this volume are not actually included in the book itself, presumably for lack of space. He could only make it so big after all. But early translations of them into English can be found in the supplement, making it a pretty important companion to the book, which is why I'm devoting so much space to talking about it, for fear that it might be overlooked otherwise. One thing that makes the 2 volumes of this chronicle unique, and especially important, is that they seem to have been reviewed by Abdu'l-Baha himself. At the end of each volume, Mahmud Zarghani mentions explicitly that he presented Abdu'l-Baha with his account. And we also have an eyewitness record of this from Ahmad Sohrab, who was one of Abdu'l-Baha's other secretaries. And it is probably for this reason that in a letter from the Universal House of Justice dated April 30th, 1984, they refer to the original volumes of this chronicle as constituting, quote, a reliable account of Abdu'l-Baha's travels in the West and an authentic record of his utterances. And to my mind, this means that while the words attributed to Abdu'l-Baha in it don't have the status of sacred text because they weren't written by Abdu'l-Baha himself, they still definitely carry much more weight than unverified pilgrim's notes. Now, having said all that, let's go ahead and dive into the second volume. Obviously, there's only so much I can cover in this limited amount of time, so I'm just going to give you highlights from each stage of Abdu'l-Baha's journey. On December 5th, 1912, Abdu'l-Baha concludes his journey throughout the United States and sets sail for England, arriving there about a week later. Then, on January 6th, 1913, he takes a short trip to Scotland, returning to England on January 10th. On January 21st, he leaves England for France, where he stays for more than 2 months. On April 1st, he sets off for Germany, and a week after that, he goes to Hungary. 10 days later, he travels to Austria. Then on April 24th, he returns to Germany. And then on the 1st of May, he returns to France. Once again, he stays in this country for a considerable period, this time a month and a half. And eventually on June 13th, he sets sail from France to Egypt, bidding farewell to the West at last. He stays in Egypt for about 5.5 months before finally setting sail on December 2nd for the Holy Land, where he arrives on December 5th. So, to begin, Abdu'l-Baha and his retinue set sail from America on December 5th, 1912. They sailed on the Celtic, which was an ocean liner owned by the White Star Line, a British company. We know that he stayed in stateroom on the upper deck while his retinue lodged in the lower deck, but they all spent their time together for the most part. He would drink Persian tea every morning and afternoon during this voyage, sometimes in his room, sometimes outside, and he would often take walks in front of his room before having his lunch and dinner. In fact, he was very fond of walking as a form of exercise. In spite of his advanced age, being almost 70 at the time, he did it all the time, and his long walks are mentioned several times throughout this chronicle. The circumstances of this voyage from America to England changed from day to day. Sometimes the waters were calm, at others the ocean became turbulent, and Mahmud Zarghani mentions the rising and falling of towering waves, those are his words, at one point. Also, there was a band of some sort, probably an orchestra, given the size and nature of the ship, and this orchestra would play on a stage inside the ship several times after each meal over the course of the day to entertain the passengers. So I've mentioned Abdu'l-Baha's retinue. This consisted of Mirza Mahmud Zarghani, who wrote down everything that was happening, and he's the reason we have this chronicle and this presentation. Mirza Ahmad Sohrab, who served as Abdu'l-Baha's interpreter, translating his talks and other remarks into English in real time, and Sayyid Asadullah Rumi, who often prepared Abdu'l-Baha's meals. It's worth mentioning that Ahmad Sohrab also wrote his own English account of everything that was happening in the form of daily letters he would send to a Baha'i in America. These letters are not published. They're held at the National Baha'i Archives in Wilmette, Illinois. But the staff there kindly provided me with scans of the letters at my request, and they proved very useful to my work, because they often filled in gaps or provided clarification on certain details recorded by Mahmud Zarghani. And you're going to see some examples of that as we go on. So on December 5th, which was the first day of Abdu'l-Baha's voyage from New York to Liverpool, he made these remarks about the journey throughout America he had just concluded. The significance of this journey will become known in the future. Up until the present time, such a thing has not happened before, and has never been witnessed in any age, that a person from the East should travel to the farthest cities of the West, teaching the cause of God, promulgating its new precepts, and expounding upon questions of theology, in temples and in gatherings of various peoples, with such resolve and conviction that none is able to reject or object to them. On the contrary, all have been enamored of and enraptured by these ideas, and express their deepest reverence for them. A few days later, on December 10th, or December 9th according to Ahmad Sohrab, Abdu'l-Baha rewards a ship attendant for his trustworthiness. Mahmud Zarghani writes, "The master offered a fruit basket to one of the attendants. As it happened, a small box that belonged to him had fallen into that basket. After a few minutes, the attendant brought the box back to the master. The master rejoiced at the trustworthiness of this attendant, so much so that he gave the box back to him and tipped him $1. He said to the attendant, 'Your honesty and trustworthiness have pleased me greatly.' The master then gave a lengthy exposition on the merits of trustworthiness. This talk was enlightening and served to remind those present of the benefits of this virtue." And among these remarks on this virtue, Sohrab writes that Abdu'l-Baha referred to trustworthiness as, quote, "the most brilliant jewel in the diadem which crowns man's heavenly attributes," end quote. And that one snippet, unfortunately, seems to be the only direct quote from this lengthy exposition on the merits of trustworthiness that has survived. At least it's all I was able to find. On December 13th, 1912, the ship arrives in Liverpool. And we're just going to do one highlight from Abdu'l-Baha's brief stay in Liverpool, which concerns the talk he gave at a Baptist church called the Pembroke Chapel. The church was packed with people on that occasion. Ahmad Sohrab notes, almost rather incredibly to me at least, that 1,500 people were in attendance. And Abdu'l-Baha spoke to them on the essential unity of all religions, the detriments of blind imitation, the spread of this new and wondrous cause, meaning the Bahá'í faith, and the greatness and veracity of Islam, meaning the status of Islam as a true religion of divine origin. Abdu'l-Baha is applauded vigorously both before and after his talk, and he closes with a prayer at the request of the Reverend Donald Fraser, who showers him with even more praise afterwards. As with many of Abdu'l-Baha's talks mentioned in this presentation, a translation of this one into English can be found in the online supplement to the book. From there, Abdu'l-Baha goes to London, where he is greeted at Lime Street Station by a group of Baha'is that includes Lady Blomfield, who pleads with Abdu'l-Baha to stay at her home, and he eventually agrees to do this. Describing that scene, Mahmud Zarghani writes, "The cries of jubilation they raised were so loud as to draw the attention of those around them, and demonstrate to those onlookers the ardor of their devotion to the Master." A couple of days later, on December 18th, Abdu'l-Baha meets with the eminent Orientalist, Professor Edward Granville Brown, for the first time in more than 20 years. The last time they had crossed paths, as some of you may know, was in Akka, when Brown had his famous interview with Baha'u'llah in April 1890. Brown began their conversation by wanting to apologize for some of his past mistakes. I'm not going to expand on those here in the interest of time, but suffice it to say that Abdu'l-Baha preferred to be merciful and insist that they change the subject, saying, "We should discuss other matters that will generate feelings of love." At one point, as they were discussing the importance of balancing knowledge with a good character, Abdu'l-Baha said, "If the acquisition of knowledge is coupled with the best of characters, that knowledge will bring about marvelous results. Material progress and civilization alone will not suffice, and the acquisition of knowledge by itself will not result in complete prosperity." At Brown's request, he meets with Abdu'l-Baha again the next day, December 19th, and Abdu'l-Baha would go on to meet with Brown a third and final time in Paris a few months later on March 9th. In his own account, Ahmad Sohrab writes that Abdu'l-Baha and Edward Brown conversed in Persian during each of these meetings, and that the first one lasted for nearly an hour, while the second one went for 2 hours. Let's jump ahead now to Christmas Day. Abdu'l-Baha visits this factory building that was being leased to the Salvation Army Center for use as a night shelter, where he spoke to a gathering of the poor to tell them that poverty is beloved by God. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "Those in the audience were so moved by these words, stirred to their very cores, that they repeatedly applauded the master and raised uproars of jubilation." Since this was Christmas Day, Abdu'l-Baha treated everyone to dinner by giving them each some money. Again, Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "So great was the clamor raised by those present, and so vigorous the praises and benedictions they heaped upon the master, that the walls of that space seemed to shake." Speaking of which, it seems we don't know exactly how many people were present. Mahmoud Zarghani says, most conservatively actually, that there were about 500 people. Ahmad Sohrab says 700, and Isabel Fraser, who took down an account of the whole occasion, says there were as many as 1,000. So I guess a definite figure remains to be seen. But in any case, following that event, Abdu'l-Baha proceeds to the upper floor to examine the sleeping accommodations and other amenities of that building. According to Mahmoud Zarghani, the master considered this arrangement highly commendable, inasmuch as it was a kind service that provided support to the poor. 2 days later, on December 27th, Abdu'l-Baha addresses another gathering of the poor, this time at the Cedars Club. What's special about this gathering is that there were many children who believed that Abdu'l-Baha was Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, as he is known in the UK. According to an account of this event by Louise Heron Oliphant, there were about 60 mothers and more than 100 children. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "He kissed the children, caressed them tenderly, and gave each one of them a present. Whenever the children would attain his presence, cherishing the hope of his grace, they would invariably declare, 'This is the divine khezr. These are heavenly showers of grace.' This is because the children of America and Europe believe that khezr appears to children at Christmas time and gives them presents." And I have to clarify something here, of course, which is that khezr is the name of a prophetic figure in Islam who is mentioned indirectly in the Quran as the spiritual guide of Moses. That being the case, I've never been able to figure out why Mahmoud Zarghani apparently equated him with Santa Claus or Father Christmas here, but I've always found it very interesting and frankly a little amusing that he did. On New Year's Eve, Abdu'l-Baha takes a day trip to Oxford. He starts by paying a visit to the Bahá'í professor Thomas Kelly Cheney and his wife Elizabeth Gibson Cheney. T.K. Cheney was an invalid at this time. He was paralyzed and confined to a wheelchair, but he had written some pieces on the Bahá'í faith, and for this reason Abdu'l-Baha loved him very much. Mahmoud Zarghani writes that he repeatedly kissed the professor's forehead and cheeks, and tenderly stroked his face and hair with his blessed hand. From there, Abdu'l-Baha sets out for the University of Oxford, where he speaks to a distinguished audience at Manchester College, one of the constituent colleges of the University of Oxford, and he concludes the gathering with a prayer. After that, he returns to the Cheney residence and gives a talk to some professors and other university officials before going back to London. In Mahmoud Zarghani's entry a couple of months later, on March 4th, 1913, he quotes Abdu'l-Baha as saying that, quote, "The writings of Professor Cheney will be weighed against the writings of his peers from former times, and the greatness of this cause will then become known." Then, on January 6th, 1913, Abdu'l-Baha and his retinue take a short trip to Scotland, specifically to Edinburgh, which is its capital. The next day, on January 7th, Abdu'l-Baha visited the Outlook Tower, an old observatory that a Scottish polymath named Patrick Geddes had bought and turned into a center of learning. One of the unique things about this tower is that it had something called a camera obscura. This is a darkened chamber in which the image of an object is received through a small opening or lens and projected onto a surface in real time, allowing viewers to watch outside scenes as if from a movie without the use of a modern camera. This is called pinhole projection, and in describing it, Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "All the buildings and streets, the carriages and trains, the coming and going of various people, even the smoke billowing from the factories. All these took on the form of motion pictures, and this was met with ample praise from the master. In the evening, Abdu'l-Baha speaks to the local Esperanto society about the implementation of a universal language. The venue was at capacity with 1,000 people seated inside, so a few hundred more attendees had to stand outside. That same day, or the following day, according to Ahmad Sohrab, Abdu'l-Baha went to the Edinburgh College of Art and the North Cannon Gate School, which Mahmoud Zarghani calls a school for poor children. In the evening, Abdu'l-Baha delivered an address at Rainey Hall, which was a divinity school. The gathering was organized by the Outlook Tower Society, presided over by the aforementioned Patrick Geddes, and attended by eminent clergymen and other distinguished people. In this talk, Abdu'l-Baha spoke about the teachings of Baha'u'llah, the calamities that have befallen the cause, and the unstoppable exaltation of God's word. When he finished speaking, some of the prominent men who were present rose to praise him. This included Dr. Alexander Hugh Freeland Barber, a Scottish gynecologist, the Reverend Alexander B. Robb, the Reverend Robert B. Drummond, and of course, Patrick Geddes himself, the chairman of that gathering, pictured here. After that short trip to Scotland, Abdu'l-Baha and his retinue returned to England. A few days into that sojourn, on January 15th, he goes to Clifton, which is a suburb of the city of Bristol. He spends the night at the Clifton Guest House, which was a hotel owned by Wellesley Tudor Pole, an early British Baha'i. And in the evening, Abdu'l-Baha gives a talk there on the Lesser Peace. Once again, the place was packed, and really surprisingly, Mahmoud Zarghani writes that every member of the audience came up to Abdu'l-Baha afterwards, kneeled before him, took hold of his hands and the hem of his garment, and sought his blessings. Mind you, they weren't bowing themselves down or prostrating themselves to the ground, but getting down on one knee, or both of their knees, still makes for quite a sight, and indeed it was a most impressive sight, especially for one Persian in the audience, in particular, who was not a Baha'i. This was a man named Dost Muhammad Khan, to whom Mahmoud Zarghani refers by his state title of Mu'ayyirul Mamalik. Here is how Mahmoud describes that gentleman's reaction to what he was witnessing. As this scene was taking place, my eyes fell upon the Mu'ayyirul Mamalik, who had accompanied the master on this trip to Clifton, Bristol. I noticed that he was looking with complete astonishment upon the reverence and humility that the most distinguished people of England were showing before the power of this cause and the might of the master, and I saw that he was crying profusely, so much so that it aroused great tenderness within me. Indeed, to see this gentleman so profoundly affected by this scene moved me, in turn, to shed tears of ecstasy. I rejoiced in my heart of hearts and gave thanks for those promised confirmations that had been vouchsafed from the Abha kingdom. After spending the night at the Clifton Guest House, like I mentioned before, Abdu'l-Baha and his retinue returned to London the next day. On January 17th, Abdu'l-Baha takes a day trip to the town of Woking, where he speaks at two gatherings. First, a private luncheon at the building for a British journal called the Asiatic Quarterly Review, attended by Muslims, Christians, and certain dignitaries, and then a public event at the Shah Jahan Mosque, again attended by Muslims, Christians, and others. At the mosque, Abdu'l-Baha speaks about the foundation and truth of the divine religions, and expounds the teachings of universal peace and oneness of humanity. I believe at least some of the audience had to stand outside, if I remember correctly, and in spite of the fact that it was raining, they stayed put and listened with rapt attention. This is one of the rare cases where we actually have the full transcript of the original talk in Persian. It's kind of buried in an issue of Star of the West, which was an early Baha'i magazine. And for that reason, it has not gotten much attention up until now, as far as I can tell. But my provisional translation of that talk into English is included in the supplement to the book. Abdu'l-Baha actually concludes his Persian address with an Arabic prayer that has a very Quranic flavor to it, if I can call it that. And this shows how attuned he was to the sensibilities of his audience and the venue where he was speaking. And on that note, I think this may be the only mosque in the West that Abdu'l-Baha ever visited, let alone spoke at, which only makes the occasion that much more remarkable. And if I'm mistaken about that, I hope someone will correct me. A few days later, Abdu'l-Baha leaves England for the last time and heads to France. As you can see from these dates, this sojourn lasted for more than 2 months. And that is a lot of ground to cover, and we obviously can't do it all here, so I want to start this portion of the presentation with an overview of the places Abdu'l-Baha went to and the people he associated with before we get into some of the specific days. Because one thing to know about Abdu'l-Baha's time in Paris in 1913 is that he didn't speak at very many large gatherings and grand halls like he did in England and other parts of Europe. Rather, he mostly spent his time talking with visitors he received at his residence, or paying visits to various people at their homes. So these would be smaller, more intimate settings. So here we have an apartment building on 30 Rue Saint-Didier, where Abdu'l-Baha stayed for the first couple of months of this sojourn. This later became known as the Cecile Hotel, as is mentioned on this postcard. On March 19th, he and his retinue moved into the Martha Pension. This was a place calling themselves a family hotel. That's also how Mahmoud Zarghani refers to it in his book. That building was located on Lauriston Street, and it is not pictured here simply because I could not find a photo of it. And here we have another postcard, this one showing the street adjoining Bois de Boulogne, a large public park where Abdu'l-Baha would go for walks. At that time, there were 2 weekly gatherings held at the homes of 2 Baha'i couples on different weeknights. On Monday nights, there was a gathering at the home of Frank Edwin Scott and Josephine Sanford Scott, American painters who had moved to France. And on Friday nights, there was one at the home of Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney, a lawyer and translator of Baha'i texts, and Laura Dreyfus Barney, a writer, artist, and social activist. Abdu'l-Baha himself would often speak at these gatherings, and sometimes other Baha'is spoke on various topics as well. And these meetings were characterized by abundant love, warmth, and fellowship. For the most part, Abdu'l-Baha attended both of these weekly gatherings, except for when his poor health or fatigue prevented him from doing so. And I want to add very quickly here that this portrait of Josephine Scott on the left was taken when she was a young woman. I just used this one because I didn't have a good portrait of her as an older woman. In reality, she was only 1 year younger than her husband. And of course, Abdu'l-Baha met with many other Baha'is while in Paris. To name just a few examples, we have Edith Sanderson, an American Baha'i who also held gatherings of her own at her home. Horace Hawley, an American Baha'i who at that time operated an art gallery in France, and then in 1914 returned to America, where he served on the National Spiritual Assembly for many years. Stanwood Cobb, an American Baha'i educator who was much younger at the time than he is in this portrait, but I didn't have a photo of him as a younger man. Haji Abul Hassan Ardakani, known by his title of Haji Amin, who served as trustee of Huququllah for many years. Waliullah and Azizullah Vargha, the sons of the martyred Baha'i poet Ali Muhammad Vargha. Mirza Ali Akbar Nakhjavani, an important figure in the early Baha'i community of Baku in today's Azerbaijan, and also the father of the late Ali Nakhjavani, who served on the Universal House of Justice for 40 years. Mirza Ali Akbar Rafsanjani, a young Baha'i travel teacher, and Mirza Agha Khan Ra'im Maghami, a very wealthy Baha'i and great-grandson of Mirza Abul Qasim Farahani, known as the Ra'im Magham, an eminent Persian statesman of outstanding character who happened to have been a close friend of Baha'u'llah's father. While in France, Abdu'l-Baha also met with several political figures, including Saleh Munir Pasha, an Ottoman diplomat who held various posts in the government of the Ottoman Empire, some of which were ministerial in nature. Rashid Pasha, who years earlier had served as governor of the province of Beirut, while Abdu'l-Baha was under house arrest in Akka. And Abdus Samad Khan, known as Mumtaz Saltaneh, a Persian diplomat who held many posts in his career and was serving at that time as the Persian minister in Paris. And in addition to all those people, Abdu'l-Baha also met with people of more mystical persuasions, such as Mira Al-Fasa, who was so active in the Baha'i community of Paris that many believed her to be a Baha'i, but who in fact displayed a very keen interest in Sufism, and eventually went to India, where she became a Hindu guru, adopting for herself the title of the Mother. And Abdu'l-Baha also met her husband, Paul Richard, both pictured here. Additionally, he met Enayat Khan, a singer, poet, professor of musicology, and founder of the Enayati order of Sufism. So, getting into some specific dates now. On February 2nd, we have a lovely account of Abdu'l-Baha encouraging the believers. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, Mr. Alfred Bernard and his wife, Claire Bernard, then expressed to the Master their regrets that they were possessed of little capacity. In response, the Master said, if the love of Baha'u'llah is present in a heart, it will be endowed with capacity. Divine love is like a spirit. When a spirit is present in a body, that body is endowed with the capacity to do anything. We were passing by a church today that was built according to the principles of Greek architecture, when my companions observed that this church was dedicated to Mary Magdalene. When one considers her outwardly, what capacity did Mary Magdalene have? She was a woman who hailed from a village. There have been many women greater than she was, women descended from the kings of the earth, or numbered with the most renowned of its denizens. Yet, since the love of Christ was present in Mary Magdalene's heart, that love endowed her with such capacity that a church in France, such as this one, was built in her name. Thus, anyone who discovers their relationship with God will be endowed with every conceivable capacity. Then do not say, we are bereft of capacity. When the love of Baha'u'llah is present in your hearts, you will possess every conceivable capacity and every measure of worthiness. A couple of days after that, Abdu'l-Baha is visited by a Persian Baha'i poet named Agha Mirza Hossein Arif, who, like some other Persian Baha'is of his time, revered Abdu'l-Baha to the point of deifying him, or making a god out of him. On that occasion, he recited these verses from a poem he wrote in praise of Abdu'l-Baha. Benighted do we languish in the darkness, and there's no light more glorious than thee. In truth, I swear upon Baha himself, that no better Baha'i is there than thee. Though all see themselves as slaves to the Lord, this slave is sure no God can surpass thee. Could Moses see thy face upon the mount, all hail this best encounter, would say he. If Asia should be sick and sore afflicted, and Europe its fatal calamity, there's no physician better for this illness, indeed no better remedy than thee. After quoting these verses in his chronicle, Mahmoud Zarghani writes, a great many individuals, not affiliated with the faith and belonging to every land imaginable, composed such poems of praise and adoration, and presented them before the Master. The majority of these he refused to accept, and he forbade them from being disseminated and published. Indeed, even the sincere praises that believers and others alike would express were, for the most part, not compatible with the Master's temperament, and contrary to his complete and total servitude at the divine threshold, and he would reject them accordingly. The next day, Abdu'l-Baha and some Persian Baha'is visit the Eiffel Tower, where they take this well-known photograph. I'm sure many of you have seen it before, and now you're about to get the context for it. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, the Persian believers wished to take a photograph with the Master that day, and it was taken as he was standing underneath the Eiffel Tower, alongside a number of believers and servants of the sacred threshold. Both before the picture was taken and afterwards, those devoted souls brimmed with delight as they relished the elegant majesty and graceful grandeur of the Master's gait. A few days later, on February 12th, Abdu'l-Baha gives an evening address to the Paris Esperanto group at the Hôtel Moderne. According to Mahmoud Zarghani, the Master's talk roused his audience to such irrepressible excitement that they punctuated his delivery with rapturous laughter, praise, and applause. Such was their state even as they had dinner afterwards, and as the banquet drew to a close, each and every one of them approached the Master and expressed their sincere devotion and deference to him. Those who had not previously had a chance to attain the Master's presence requested permission to do so, and when it was granted them, they asked him for the address of the residence where he was staying. Again, as with several of the talks mentioned in this presentation, a translation of this one into English can be found in the online supplement to the book. About a week later, while some of the Baha'is of Paris are gathered at Abdu'l-Baha's apartment, he rallies them with rousing admonitions. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "Among the remarks the master made in the talk he gave to the public gathering that morning were these: 'Nothing but the cause of God is worthy of your attachment. All affairs but those which pertain to God are fleeting and undeserving of mention.'" Mahmoud Zarghani continues, "That day, the master repeatedly encouraged the Baha'is, in particular Miss Sanderson, to teach the cause, exhorting them with these words: 'Speak at the gatherings, be as a flame of fire and a brilliant star. Thereby you shall illumine this city. I work day and night to help you spread your wings, that you might help others to progress, and guide them to promulgate the cause in turn. Otherwise, should a person not be aided and confirmed in the cause of God, he will bear no fruit, and his life shall have failed to make its mark.'" Skipping ahead by a little more than a month now, on March 27th, or March 31st, according to Ahmad Sohrab, Abdu'l-Baha met with Henri Moser, who was a Swiss traveler and art collector, and also with his wife, Sophie. Henri Moser was about the same age as Abdu'l-Baha. He had traveled in Central Asia, including to Bukhara and Ashgabad, and he had accumulated a priceless collection of Oriental weapons and artifacts. Abdu'l-Baha speaks with them for a while. Mahmoud Zarghani actually has a pretty extensive record of their exchanges in Persian, meaning he recorded it in Persian, not that Henri Moser and his wife were speaking Persian, of course. The Mosers respond very favorably to the remarks Abdu'l-Baha was making to them. Here's a snippet of what they said. "We are well informed of this cause. It is truly a light from the East, and it will surely become the means through which peace is established. The thing about this cause which truly demands careful attention is that spiritual power that will conduce to peace and unity. Were it not for this, we too have held many gatherings that were all devoted to peace, yet every one of them has proven futile and yielded no fruit." At the end of their conversation, the Mosers repeatedly invite Abdu'l-Baha to come to their residence for the summer, but he politely declines the invitation, insisting that he and his retinue are on a mission and that they need to see it through to the end. This takes us to the first of Abdu'l-Baha's two brief sojourns in Germany. Shortly after arriving in the city of Stuttgart, while gathered with some of the Baha'is there, he said, "Behold what the grace and bounty of Baha'u'llah have done. Observe where we are and where you are. See how this grace and bounty have gathered us together in one place, how they have bound the hearts to one another, and delighted the souls with the glad tidings of God. What bonds are these, what love is this, that derive their power from no earthly source? To outward seeming, neither had we heard the name of Stuttgart, nor had you all heard the name of Nur. The power of the word of God has rent the veils asunder. How wonderfully has this power united us! How completely has it bound the hearts together! How remarkably has it made the East and the West as one! How it has brought the far removed so close together and turned strangers into friends." The day after that, Abdu'l-Baha takes a day trip to Esslingen, where he attends a festival held in his honor, on behalf of the Baha'i children. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "When the master arrived, he found that all the children, dressed in their school uniforms, had formed a neatly ordered line extending from the entrance of the building all the way to its main room. They all expressed their reverence for the master and exclaimed, 'Allahu Abha.' The master walked gracefully among those children, handing sweets to each and every one of them and caressing them tenderly." And here are some of the remarks Abdu'l-Baha made at this children's festival. "What precious children these are! I beseech God to send down from the heavens a blessing on these children, that even as the flowers of the most glorious garden, they may flourish with verdure. May the light of the love of God make each of them as brilliant lamps, and may they derive their portion of splendor, shining from the day star of the most glorious paradise. These children are the fruits of the tree of the love of God. They are the saplings of the Abha kingdom. Their hearts are pure to the utmost, and their souls are as undefiled and delicate as can be. I hope, therefore, that even as pearls they may be nurtured in the shell of the love of God. After spending a few more days in Germany, Abdu'l-Baha sets out for Hungary. Shortly after his arrival in Budapest, Abdu'l-Baha visits the eminent professor, traveler, and Orientalist Armin Vámbéry. Here is Mahmud Zarghani's summary of that visit. In the afternoon, the master paid a visit to the renowned philosopher, Professor Vámbéry, who was sick at the time. This professor had a strong command of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. The professor listened to the master's words and was profoundly affected by what he heard. He considered the master's mighty endeavors to be truly extraordinary. On several occasions from that point forward, he lauded the principles and ordinances of this revelation as the most potent cure for the inveterate diseases afflicting the peoples of the earth, and he arose to promote the principles of this most great cause with the utmost devotion and conviction. Vámbéry called on Abdu'l-Baha the next day, but he wasn't home, and Abdu'l-Baha would pay Vámbéry a second visit the day after that on April 14th. Following Abdu'l-Baha's departure from Hungary, he and Vámbéry have a little more correspondence that you can find in the full book. Not the supplement this time, the actual full book. It is very much worth noting, additionally, that Vámbéry accepted the Bahá'í faith as a result of Abdu'l-Baha's visit to Hungary, and that's certainly the impression one gets in reading these words by Mahmud Zarghani. Speaking of April 14th, Abdu'l-Baha gave an address that evening to the Turanian or Turanian Society at the Hungarian National Museum. It was attended by hundreds of people, in spite of unseasonably cold weather. Remember, this is in April, and yet Mahmud Zarghani mentions that a fierce blizzard was raging just the day before. This is another one of those rare cases where we have an authenticated Persian transcript of this talk. It was actually made available on the Baha'i Reference Library just a couple of months ago, and you can find my provisional translation of it into English in the supplement of the book. Here's an excerpt from Mahmud Zarghani's description of that event. The imposing power he projected at that gathering captivated the attention and enraptured the hearts of those present more than on any other such occasion. Indeed, their ecstasy and delight could be likened to the commotion of the gathering crowd on the day of resurrection. The sudden onset of such intensely cold weather, however, must have posed a shock to Abdu'l-Baha's system, so to speak, because the very next day he fell sick with a cold that waxed and waned for several months thereafter. It didn't really leave him until he finally returned to Egypt in the summer, where it was, of course, much warmer. A few days after that, Abdu'l-Baha leaves Hungary for Austria, staying in Vienna for about a week. He had been invited there by two theosophists, Johann Kreutz and Marie Thaler, and on his first full day there, Abdu'l-Baha says the following to both of them. "Your love is the reason I have come here. I have come to see you, not to go on leisurely excursions, for we are in search of people, and wherever we find them, it brings us matchless joy. We hope that this meeting with us will yield results that shall illumine the hearts and irradiate the souls with the light of supreme guidance. Thereby may every eye be brightened and every heart attain everlasting joy and bliss. Thereby may all come together with tranquil souls and well-assured hearts beneath the shade of the pavilion of the oneness of humanity, and thereby may eternal peace, harmony, welfare, and prosperity be realized on earth. For we are all the members of humankind, all the servants of one loving God." Several days later, Marie Thaler mentions to Abdu'l-Baha that she is a Baha'i. Remember, she was a theosophist before. I assume that she means that she embraced the faith because of Abdu'l-Baha's visit, so there is an immediate effect there. That same day, or 2 days later by Ahmad Sohrab's account, Abdu'l-Baha goes to the residence of a certain Mrs. Lukeneder and her son Paul, which was high up in a new apartment building. The Lukeneder's home functioned as the lodge of the local Theosophical Society, and it was there that Abdu'l-Baha gave an extensive address that evening, even though he had completely exhausted himself just getting there. Mahmud Zarghani writes, "Although the master was very tired as a result of the cold he had caught in Budapest, he walked up 120 steps of that building nevertheless to get to the main hall of the Theosophical Society. This because the building was still new, and an elevator had not yet been installed to transport people. When he reached the 4th floor, he did not enter the main hall at first, owing to his great fatigue. Instead, he initially went to a different room and conversed with certain individuals. One can well imagine the great strain that must have been placed on the master's body when he then went to the public gathering. And in fact, Abdu'l-Baha himself attests to this fatiguing experience in one of his tablets, which I have translated in the supplement to the book. And I will quote the relevant passage here for you. Especially taxing was one night in particular, when I went to a place where there were 120 stairs made of marble that was cold as ice. I ascended them with exceeding powerlessness and fatigue, and then spoke for 2 hours without interruption. I promoted the word of God, and my talk was accompanied by a comprehensive translation. A few days later, Abdu'l-Baha and his retinue have an interesting experience at the Stadtpark, or city park. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, "Once his visitors had been dismissed, expressing the utmost devotion and ecstasy as they departed, the master said, 'Today is a good day. Let us walk for a bit in the garden,' by which he means Stadtpark. He used the word Bahr, which means garden, but I get the impression it was being used interchangeably to also mean park in this chronicle. The master went outside with his attendants, who were wearing their Persian hats and other attire. This drew the attention of onlookers from every direction, which prompted the master to remark, 'This clothing of ours is itself an announcer of the cause.' When the master reached the park in the center of the city, he found a large number of people there. They all turned to look at him, and most of them approached him from the various corners of the park with curiosity. Mr. Wilhelm Herregel and some other friends discussed the cause of God with them, and provided them with the addresses of both the master's hotel and also the residences of certain believers. On his last day in Vienna, Abdu'l-Baha meets with Baroness Bertha von Suttner, who in 1905 had become the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Mahmoud Zarghani has given this short description of their meeting. Among the other important individuals who were thoroughly cheered and illumined by having had the bounty of being in the master's presence was Baroness Bertha von Suttner. This woman was an earnest promoter of peace. She was deeply respected and widely renowned, and the master showed her great loving kindness. He spoke to her of universal peace and the Bahá'í faith, and this served to gladden her heart, broaden her mind, and brighten her soul. She was then dismissed, and she displayed the utmost devotion as she departed the master's presence. So as you can see, that's a fairly limited account of the occasion. It doesn't give you much insight into what was really said. Fortunately, Ahmad Sohrab did record quite a bit of Abdu'l-Baha's conversation with the Baroness, and you can find his transcript of that talk, rather the conversation, in the supplement to the book. Abdu'l-Baha then returns to Germany and stays there for about a week. During a gathering with some Baha'is, Abdu'l-Baha has occasion to speak glowingly of Mirza Abul Fazl, the eminent Baha'i scholar, author, and teacher. Mahmoud Zarghani writes, Mr. Friedrich Schweizer then mentioned the translation of certain books written for the cause of God, and spoke highly of the brilliant proof of Mirza Abul Fazl in particular. The master said, I love him very much. In order to leave himself free to serve the cause of God, he has not married. He is always occupied with promoting the word of God. He has not rested for a single moment of the days of his life. He has either engaged himself in teaching the cause, or set himself to composing treatises, or devoted himself to traveling, or spent his days in prison. He is an exceedingly blessed individual, and it is for this reason that I love him dearly. I want to add here that Ahmad Sohrab's account of Abdu'l-Baha's response to Schweizer is largely the same as what Zarghani has recorded here. But Sohrab's version adds this notable remark about Mirza Abul Fazl. He is greater even than the apostles, meaning the apostles of Christ. And of course, Shoghi Effendi would go on to name Mirza Abul Fazl as one of the 19 apostles of Baha'u'llah. So a bit of fulfillment there in this dispensation, I suppose. On Abdu'l-Baha's last day in Germany, he gives many, many words of farewell to the Baha'is of Stuttgart. Mahmud Zarghani has recorded several paragraphs worth of parting words and final counsels, and I want to give you just a sample of those here. I want to say goodbye to you, but at the same time my heart wishes to stay with you. Meeting is just as sweet as parting is bitter, but neither our farewells nor the distance between us will prevent our nearness to one another, inasmuch as the love of Baha'u'llah has bound us with ties that can never be broken. Should the distance between the farthest ends of the earth be between us, it would never preclude the closeness of our hearts and souls, for spiritual sentiments are beyond any doubt. When people meet one another, it is their spirits that take pleasure in this meeting, not their bodies, and their souls that experience degrees of spiritual feeling, not their flesh. Thus, it is this spiritual feeling which is continually present. I commit you all to the sheltering shade of the protection and aid of Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Baha then returns to France for the last time, staying there for nearly a month and a half. To give you an overview of this final sojourn in Paris before getting into some specific dates, Abdu'l-Baha stays at the Baltimore Hotel at first, then moves back into the Martha Pension family hotel mentioned earlier. Here you can see a postcard of the Baltimore Hotel with a note at the top, I think in Ahmad Sohrab's handwriting. It says, "This is the hotel in which the master lives on first floor." That should be the first floor, of course. English was not Sohrab's native language. And the note is dated May 1st, 1913. Similar to the last time Abdu'l-Baha was in Paris, he mostly gathered with Baha'is and others in smaller, more intimate settings at his hotel, or their own residences. And this did include the weekly evening gatherings at the Scots on Monday nights and the Dreyfus Barneys on Friday nights, mentioned before. And unfortunately, Abdu'l-Baha was still dealing with that lingering cold that he had caught in Budapest. Something very interesting happens the day after Abdu'l-Baha returns to Paris. Mahmud Zarghani writes, "The fame of the grandeur of the master's journey had reached such great proportions that a French newspaper featuring an extensive article which discussed his travels and mentioned the spread of the teachings of peace and unity was shown at that gathering. Included in the article was a full-page color illustration of the master, in which he was standing before a large crowd of Muslims at a mosque in Constantinople, which we now call Istanbul, of course. He had been depicted while speaking, suggesting that he was imparting counsels. His hands were raised up, and all those present were listening with the utmost humility. The caption accompanying the image stated that a new prophet of Islam was summoning the followers of the various religions to oneness and unity. Seeing this image brought an ample smile to the master's face." And here is the image in question. I think someone's got their mic unmuted. We could take care of that. So this is the image in question, and it is, of course, a fictitious illustration of Abdu'l-Baha, published in the weekly supplement to a French journal called Le Petit Journal. So he never actually did this. He was never in this setting giving this sort of talk. In fact, he wasn't even this age that is shown here. He was a much younger man. So it's anachronistic in that sense too. Anyway, while Mahmud Zarghani did paraphrase the caption in the description we just read, a more direct translation of the original French caption, since we have it, would be "The new prophet of Islam, Abdu'l-Baha preaching calm and brotherhood in a mosque in Constantinople." Jumping ahead by about 3 weeks, we have this touching and fascinating anecdote from Abdu'l-Baha, as recorded by Mahmud Zarghani, who writes, "Shortly after nightfall, the master went to the home of that handmaid of God, Miss Sanderson. He showed her great loving kindness and commended the way she conversed with him in Persian. He instructed that she read the poems of the Blessed Beauty and commit them to memory. After promising her that she would be confirmed and aided to progress, she said, 'I have not studied Arabic. When I was a child, I had a book of the Bab's prayers in the handwriting of the Blessed Beauty, and I very much yearned to read it. At night, I would waken, get out of bed, and peruse this book, and the fervor of my quest, the intensity of my longing, would move me to tears. Eventually, I saw that I understood Arabic well. My old friends know well that I have not studied Arabic, and yet I speak and write it better than the most eloquent of Arabs. I hope that you make great progress in learning the Persian language.'" And in fact, Abdu'l-Baha's hope would be fulfilled, in that many years later, Edith Sanderson translated Durus ad-Diyanat, a presentation on the Bahá'í teachings from Persian into English, and this was published under the title Lessons in Religion. This is a treatise that was written by Sheikh Muhammad Ali Ghaini, an apostle of Baha'u'llah and the nephew of Nabila Akbar, who was himself an apostle of Baha'u'llah. It's worth mentioning that this encouragement from Abdu'l-Baha was constant. In Mahmud Zarghani's entry for the very next day, which is May 20th, he writes, quote, "At the end of that gathering, he encouraged Ruhiye Khanum," that is a reference to Miss Sanderson, not the future wife of Shoghi Effendi. They had the same title, it's a coincidence. Encouraged Ruhiye Khanum once again to read the Persian tablets and verses. End quote. This encouragement was also not limited just to Edith Sanderson. We have several tablets from Abdu'l-Baha to other Western Baha'is extending the same encouragement to learn Persian and, in fewer cases, Arabic, but just as important for sure. So we might do well to ponder the importance of learning the original languages of revelation. This takes us to May 23rd, which is a doubly blessed day for Baha'is because it is the day when the Bab declared his mission, and also the day Abdu'l-Baha was born. This twofold significance was not lost even on those early Baha'is in France, and they cherished the opportunity to commemorate these anniversaries with Abdu'l-Baha in person. Here is how Mahmud Zarghani's entry for that day begins. According to solar reckoning and European calendars, this day marked the birth of Abdu'l-Baha and the declaration of the Bab. May the spirits of all living things be a sacrifice for their beneficence. From early in the morning until nighttime, the believers and other friends attained the Master's presence with bouquets of flowers to extend their felicitations. They expressed their utter joy and delight, saying, "Today is a great day. It is the day of your birth, and also the day on which the Bab declared his mission." The Master said, "Indeed, as this day marks the declaration of the Bab, the day when that sun dawned forth and announced the greatest of glad tidings, it is an exceedingly blessed day. By chance, it also happens that I was born on this day." So one can't help but notice how Abdu'l-Baha relegated himself to a mere footnote to the events of that day, mentioning his birth in only the most incidental of terms. This is just one of countless instances and examples we have of his exemplary humility. Later that day, Abdu'l-Baha attends the Paris Spring Flower Show. Mahmud Zarghani writes, "There were many flowers of all kinds that had been arranged most neatly and exquisitely. Their appearance from every side filled all those present with vigor and gladness. In every corner of that space there was some color or freshness, some fragrance or delicacy, that stirred a crowd to great delight. As it was the anniversary of the Bab's declaration and that of the Master's birth, the fact that this event was, by some happy coincidence, also being held on the same day, rejoiced the eager Baha'is in attendance, and added to the attraction and excitement that those lovers of the Master were exhibiting. It was as if that festival had been held specifically to commemorate this auspicious anniversary, and it seemed that all the things of that place had been moved in their ecstasy from beholding the Master to sing songs of congratulations." Jan Yashin, author of Abdu'l-Baha in France, 1911 and 1913, has added these helpful details to that event. This year's open-air exhibit was dedicated to fruit trees and garden implements. Inside the hothouses were orchids, roses, pinks, pelargoniums, also known as geraniums, etc. How Abdu'l-Baha must have enjoyed walking among the mauve and pink sweet peas, dull red rhododendrons, and salmon pink hortensias, which were the highlights of this year's show. And to kind of lend a visual element to this slide, I've taken each of those flowers and put a picture of them here over to the right. Let's skip forward now to June 11th, the eve of Abdu'l-Baha's departure from Paris, when he addressed these parting words to the Baha'is there. "I was in your midst for some time. I have felt and still feel the utmost love towards you. My heart constantly swelled with your love. I have lit the candle of God's love in the niche of your hearts and expounded the divine admonitions for you. My hope is such that you may strive so that with every passing day, the light of God will make you ever more luminous, and the splendors of the most glorious kingdom will shine with increasing resplendence. Rest not at all as you guide the people aright. Revive these dead ones, alert the uninformed, enkindle the despondent and dispirited with the fire of the love of God. I will ever be waiting to hear good news from you. The next day, Abdu'l-Baha left Paris for the port city of Marseille, and then set sail for Egypt the day after that, never to return to the West. And as you can see from these dates, Abdu'l-Baha's voyage to Egypt was a very short one, so I'm only going to share one highlight from that stage of his journey. It's actually from the last night of his voyage, as described here by Mirza Mahmud Zarghani. That night, too, was a blessed night. Although the wind was blowing fiercely, the sea was calm and the weather was clear. In the radiance of the moonlight, the water shimmered like a spotless and sparkling mirror. The sound of the surging waves lapping the ship on either side resembled the billowing and babbling of two flowing rivers, and the ship itself seemed to whine like a young fatling, meaning a young lamb or calf, priding itself in the most great mystery it was carrying. The hearts of his devoted attendants throbbed constantly with this heavenly anthem. This is the mighty mystery, none other than the branch of old, that great secret in whom do we the mercy of the Lord behold. And afterwards they would gently murmur these words, how great indeed this blessed night, which far outranks the best of days. 'Tis on this night our sun so bright will cease to shed his western rays. His trips through Europe's land and seas upon this night have reached their end. His beauteous light, if God should please, will soon to eastern skies extend. That precious friend will disembark to lay his steps on eastern ground, and thereupon will all remark, it's here alone that heaven's found. That takes us to Egypt. And as you can see, this is a very long period, about 5.5 months. But unlike the western portions of Mahmud Zarghani's chronicle, he actually kept this section very condensed. So I'm going to emulate his approach in this portion of the presentation and keep it pretty high level. And to start with, I want to give a high-level overview of Abdu'l-Baha's last sojourn in Egypt, precisely because it was such a long period. So he arrives in Port Said on June 17th, and a little less than a month later, he leaves for Ismailiye for a change of climate. However, the climate in Ismailiye turned out not to be very different. So about a week later, he left for Ramle, a suburb of Alexandria. And that is where he primarily resided for the next 4.5 months. But he did take a couple of trips within the country afterwards. For example, on October 13th, he went to the small town of Abu Qir, but returned after just 2 days. Then, on November 8th, he went to Port Said, and came back about a week later. Eventually, on December 2nd, he left Egypt for the last time and set sail for the Holy Land. While in Port Said, Abdu'l-Baha would speak at public gatherings under a tent that had been pitched on top of the Hotel Sultani. And it was possible to set up the tent that way because, as some of you know, buildings in the Middle East used to, and they still tend to be built with flat roofs. And Abdu'l-Baha would receive private audiences at the home of Consul Ahmad Effendi Yazdi, who was a Baha'i. Here on the right, in the front row, we have a photo of that tent on top of the Hotel Sultani, and on the right in the front row, we have Mahmud Zarghani. This is a photo that actually comes from the original Persian chronicle. As was mentioned on the previous slide, Abdu'l-Baha eventually left Port Said because of its oppressively humid climate, which had a negative effect on his health. But the city he relocated to, called Ismailiye, seems to have been just as humid, if not more so. So he left that place too, and ended up in Ramle, a suburb of Alexandria, where he first lodged at the Hotel Victoria, and then moved into a house that some of the Baha'is rented for him. Abdu'l-Baha's last sojourn in Ramle was an eventful one, and we'll get into some of the details of that on the next slide. But one notable thing I want to point out here is that on August 1st, he received his sister, Bahiye Khanum, known as the Greatest Holy Leaf, his daughter, Ziya Khanum, and his grandson, Shoghi Effendi, who would have been 16 years old at the time. They all stayed in Ramleh for a little over 2 months before returning. Abdu'l-Baha also spent quite a bit of this time in the company of Mirza Abul Fazl, not just visiting and talking with him, but also personally seeing to his recovery since he was not well. And unfortunately, his illness worsened, and a few months after this, on January, I believe 21st, 1914, he passed away in Cairo. I mentioned I would give you some more details on what Abdu'l-Baha did during this stay in Ramleh. Here's how Mahmud Zarghani has described it. The master sojourned in Ramleh for 5 months. In addition to the Baha'is who came from the east and west to attain his presence, travelers from America and Europe, Jewish teachers from the Syrian Protestant College of Beirut, now known as the American University of Beirut, deputies of the Parliament of Constantinople, and some of the grandees of Egypt, including even the Khedive, Abbas Helmi Pasha, attained his presence and benefited from the gracious outpourings of the Abha kingdom on several occasions. They expressed their praise and gratitude for having met him round whom all names revolve. This is a title Baha'u'llah has bestowed on Abdu'l-Baha in his tablets. And all those blessed souls received his bounty and favor. Now, if you were to look at the book, this one paragraph has several endnotes with additional details on who these people were, when exactly Abdu'l-Baha met with them, when the circumstances, what the circumstances of their meetings were to the extent that they are even known in the first place, and so on. But for the purposes of this presentation, I thought it would suffice to just give you this high-level summary by Mahmud Zarghani. We now arrive at the very last stage, you might say the ultimate destination of Abdu'l-Baha's journey, his return to the Holy Land, where he would remain for the rest of his life. This is actually the shortest section of the book. It's only about 7 pages long in the translation, but I want to highlight events from 2 of Mahmud Zarghani's entries from this period. The day after his arrival in Haifa, Abdu'l-Baha takes a trip to the Shrine of the Bab and finds a nice surprise along the way. Mahmud Zarghani writes, as the master was heading for the Shrine of the Bab that morning, he found that all the believers, locals and travelers alike, had gathered on Mount Carmel and formed a line in the road he was crossing. When they reached the Shrine of the Bab, the master motioned to the friends to enter through the first set of doors. He himself entered through a different door and rested his brow on the sacred threshold. Apart from that particular day, whenever the believers were in his presence as they were making pilgrimage to the Shrine of the Bab or Baha'u'llah at other times, the master would first anoint them with fragrant rosewater, beckon them to enter, and then perform his own pilgrimage while standing behind everyone else. The next day, at the instruction of Abdu'l-Baha, the Baha'is take a sort of field trip, if you like, that's how I like to think of it anyway, to the Shrine of Baha'u'llah on the outskirts of Akka. Mahmud Zarghani writes, in the morning, the master instructed the believers to take a special trip to Akka to make pilgrimage to the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. Accordingly, the friends who lived in the city, rather in the vicinity, and those who had traveled from afar, nearly 100 people in all, gathered at the train station. The master took a separate railway carriage for himself. When everyone had boarded the train, they found the cars filled to the brim with Baha'is and entirely empty of anyone else. The songs and melodies they lifted up seemed to reach the clouds of the heavens. The radiance that blossomed from their faces could have put the stars and the moon themselves to shame. The joyful congratulations they offered on Abdu'l-Baha's arrival were enough to shake every limb and reveal the mysteries of the kingdom to every heart. All his ardent lovers intoned, in unison, the odes and other poems of the revered Vargha, the esteemed Andalib, Janab Bassar, and others, clapping and dancing as they sang. And they continued to sing anthems that saluted the master on his arrival up until they reached Akka. Tears fell from their eyes as they humbled themselves in fervent supplication at the threshold of the Shrine of Baha'u'llah. They entreated the Abha kingdom to confirm all the Baha'is and implored the aid and bounty of God. When they concluded their pilgrimage, they commenced festivities of heavenly communion in the pilgrim house at the mansion of Bahji. Shortly after concluding that entry, Mahmud Zarghani ends his chronicle with some closing remarks. He writes, "Praise be to God the immeasurably glorious, that through the confirmations of the Abha kingdom and the most exalted horizon, and also the assistance and bounty of Abdu'l-Baha, may my soul and my very being be offered up for such of his loved ones as are firm in his most perfect covenant. This lowly servant has successfully completed his composition of the first and second volumes of this chronicle. I was graciously aided to record episodes from the Master's journey with my own pen and then present him with my account. The manifest traces of his travels have only been chronicled to the extent that my comprehension and capacity have allowed me, not in the plenitude of their peerless glory and grandeur. How well has it been said, "As thou art truly in thyself, what eye beholdeth thee? All understand no further than their limited degree." I appeal, therefore, to the bounty and beneficence of the heavenly threshold to forgive and pardon me, and I cherish the hope that the readers of these pages may overlook my shortcomings. Through this humble drop, may they apprehend that sea of divine grace, and regard this insignificant atom as having portrayed the dazzling rays of the sun of celestial favor. Every good thing is of God, and every evil thing is from ourselves. I, the lowly servant, Mahmud ibn Ismail Zarghani, do hereby conclude the first and second volumes of this chronicle on the hallowed Mount Carmel, in the vicinity of the shrine of the Bab, and beneath the bountiful shade of Abdu'l-Baha. May my soul be offered up for the ground which the footsteps of them who are firm in his most perfect covenant have trodden. Mahmud ibn Ismail Zarghani, Sunday, July 19th, 1914. And with the conclusion of the book comes the conclusion of my presentation. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I think we can move it on over to Q&A. Thank you all very much for your patience and interest.
Wow, thank you. What an amazing job you did, and what a fantastic level, not just translating, it was also a lot of research involved in really giving life to even the diary, a new life to it, and filling in a lot of colors so that the reader can really go back with you. Thank you so much for your work. It's a very valuable contribution to Baha'i history and to Baha'i literature. Thank you. So anyone who wants to ask questions, you can raise your hand now. It's better if you do the digital hand because I will find you easier. I also do watch the chat, and you're welcome to ask questions or interact now.
Jennifer, may I make a quick request before we turn our attention to those? Would you mind removing the spotlight? It helps to also see everybody, I think, at once, if you see fit. Yeah.
But you won't see everybody because you've got 100 people and 4 pages.
Well, that's good. I was feeling pretty self-conscious anyway, so that's good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I also like it like this. But anyway, you won't. The reason why it was better the other way for me is because when then somebody raises the hand, it moves them on the top of the screen to the left. But I might not see you. But then you can also just start talking, and then you'll also move forward. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or want to say anything or any comments tonight? Please feel free. And I think that's a lot of reading we're going to all have to do soon. Anne Perry.
Well, I'm so excited the book has come out, Adib. As I've told you, I've waited for decades for this book. And it's so exciting to be able to take the journey. I wondered if in terms of general themes of his addresses, we notice things like in America, the focus on race unity, in England, the focus on peace and economic disparity, and in France, a focus on materialism versus spirituality. If you noticed any other prominent themes, maybe in Germany, in Hungary, in Vienna, or Egypt, or in general on this larger journey?
It's an excellent observation and a great question to boot. I remember, kind of by way of contrast, in America, a topic that came up quite often was the covenant and the importance of remaining faithful to it, because the American Baha'i community had definitely been tested with, the coming of Khairullah and some of his inculcations and misrepresentations about a decade or so before that. And I think there were still some lingering after effects. So this just goes to show that Abdu'l-Baha was very mindful, of course, of the settings in which he spoke always. From what I remember mostly in Germany, for example, especially from his talks to private audiences, Abdu'l-Baha really loved what he was seeing in the industriousness of the German Baha'is and their dedication and their devotion. And I think he was doing a lot to encourage that, and especially following his departure, to not let his impending departure from that place serve as an impediment to all of this fervor and zeal that they were showing at the time. To, even in my absence, I'm with you always. We hear this sort of sentiment. So he would certainly talk about that to the German friends who, out of all of the communities covered in this chronicle, I think they needed the least encouragement. They really seemed to be the most primed, and Abdu'l-Baha has many occasions to mention them in subsequent countries, like his return to France, about how much he loved being with the German Baha'is. You talked about materialism in France, and also hedonism, for sure, was a subject that came up a lot. They were involved in some hedonistic pursuits. Their priorities were all out of whack: drinking alcohol, going to theaters, and participating in I was going to say spectator sports, but things that require them to be spectators. And it's the wrong sort of priority and attitude that they had. So he was doing what he could to disabuse them of that. Of course, like I mentioned before, he didn't speak at a whole lot of larger halls and grand venues as he did in England compared to France. So those were more intimate settings. But I think his talks in France, therefore, to the Friends were mostly centered on ways to get the Friends to kind of gently nudge their interlocutors, the non-Baha'is with whom they were speaking, in the right direction, and how they could be primed to better receive the message and become more receptive, if there's any potential receptivity there at all. And in the UK, I remember it being mostly, everything I'm saying is heavily oversimplified. Of course, you'll have to read the book to really get the right level and gamut and range of what Abdu'l-Baha talked about. But overcoming prejudice and blind imitation, and keeping an open mind, not letting these things serve as barriers, preventing the acceptance of truth. I remember those being common topics, whether in Liverpool or in London. But I know there are other friends here who are English, or they live in England, and they have much more experience with that. So some of them, and other countries as well. I don't know, Germany, Hungary, we may have people from those countries in attendance. So if anyone else would like to chime in, that's in a nutshell what I can remember.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, Gamal Hassan, you.
Well, I didn't know what I'm going to say. I'm really amazed at encapsulating an entire book in such a short period of time, not to mention the task that you have taken over so many, I would say, months or whatever, or maybe years, to make this jewel available to the non-Persian speaking friends. Before getting your part of Egypt, I was relying mainly on Ahmed Sohrab's account. And last year I had a meeting with the NSA of Egypt, and they told me that they have asked the Universal House of Justice for permission to translate the Master in Egypt, which is edited by the late Ahang Rabbani. But it is just mainly the Baha'i News and Star of the West articles, followed by the full text of Sohrab Diary, that part from July 17 or whatever until December 5. But the Universal House of Justice told them, be careful when you translate Sohrab's diary, without giving really specific remarks on anything, given the fact that Sohrab broke the covenant later during the ministry of Tawfiq Effendi. Now, personally, because I have seen you constantly comparing what Ahmed Zorkani wrote with what Sohrab written, including even the variance of days, whatever, did you find anything of notice that can help someone, avoid the pitfalls of Sohrab, if there are any pitfalls really during those days that might show the early symptoms of covenant breaking? This is just what I want to say. There is also another question about the keynotes of the talks of Abdu'l-Baha in Egypt. I would answer that there was not many public talks because Abdu'l-Baha actually avoided such public talks because it was not wise at that time, to do public talks to Egypt, and his talks were mainly or predominantly for the friends there. And one talk which really stands out is his talk at Nowruz at Hotel Victoria on 21st of March or 20th of March, 1912, just 4 or 5 days before going to the United States. And then he said this is a day for, starting important projects and important enterprises, He said, really, he reminded that this could be a good chance for the Friends to start a very remarkable project. They would choose Nowruz for that day. Another was at the tent of the Musafir Khane in Port Said also. It's also recorded. But other than these two talks are just public, private interviews and talks to journalists, whatever. And him, I would say, he didn't mention his theme while in Egypt, but I remember once he was in the UK, in England, he said, I like those because here, especially in England, we see words coupled with actions. But in Egypt, we hear words, but no actions. So this is really something that strikes me up till today, that in the Orient, you may admire what people say, but still action do not match what they say. So the platform is yours now, Adib John. If you have noticed anything of notice that you can, during the comparison between Mahmoud Zoukani's and Sohrab's texts, please. Thank you.
Sure. Gamal, thank you for all of your very kind words. Very few of them, very few of which I feel I actually deserve. You're very, very kind in your encouragement. There was a lot in your comment, and you asked a central question, but I want to touch on some of the other things you also mentioned. First of all, you were right about how we have relatively few transcripts of talks by Abdu'l-Baha given in Egypt. We do have a few in Persian, like you mentioned, and those can be found in the volumes of Khitabat, I think mainly volume 3, as I'm sure you're well aware. And I think all of the ones that were contemporaneous with this chronicle, meaning up to, even beyond June 30th, I think, maybe all the way through December, there may be 2, 3, or maybe 4 such talks, including the one at Port Said, I believe you mentioned. If I have the year right, if it was 1913, that one is included there. So you could find that in the supplement. They're provisional, of course. It's not an approved provisional translation, but it may still have some use for you and other researchers. The talk you mentioned at the Hotel Victoria in 1912 on Nowruz Day, I've seen that. It's a beautiful talk, and there is an authorized translation of it on the Baha'i Reference Library for anyone who's interested. If I remember, I will get the link and paste it. It's not in a compilation anybody would have seen. You have to go to the library and look for additional talks, extracts. There is a section with a name to that effect. If you go there, maybe type in Nowruz in the search, you will find the talk that Gamal is talking about. As to the overall approach about teaching in England, I'm sorry, not England, Egypt, they both start with E. Yes, Abdu'l-Baha was, I don't want to say more discreet, but he definitely was less forthright precisely because of a lack of receptivity that he perceived, and which I'm sure was objectively the case. He comments on it. Mahmoud Zarghani records him as saying as much, and he himself, having also been an impartial observer of his own, he also makes comments to that effect. I think they're included in the section that I sent you, so presumably you would have seen them. So these are helpful observations to have, that this was a different kind of population they were dealing with, so they had to take a different tack accordingly. And in fact, we see this even maybe 15 years earlier or so with Mirza Abul Fazl. He had, prior to that, around the time of the ascension of Baha'u'llah, he had gone to Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, those sorts of places. And he took a very direct approach to teaching, and he lamented in some of his letters that he was not having very much success. And so Abdu'l-Baha, after dispatching him, or maybe as he is sending him to Egypt, gives him this sage advice, which is, take a less direct approach with them. Don't be as forthright. Do it, have it come through more through Baha'i conduct, and then that will draw people to you, and then you can slowly, gradually broach the faith with them. And as we know, he you know better than I do, he converted some 20 to 30 eminent people like Sheikh Badruddin Ghazi, Muhyiddin Sabri, Farajullah Zaki al-Kurdi, many other Egyptian, native Egyptian Baha'is. It's amazing because there were many Baha'is of Persian origin in Egypt, but I think with the advent or really the coming of Abul Faz to Egypt, it marked the entrance of native Arabs, native Egyptians into the faith. So that's a watershed moment all its own. So with all of that prefatory stuff, I will try to get to the question you actually asked. It was the central thing about discrepancies or just the coexistence of these two different sets of details between Mahmud Zarghani and Ahmad Sohrab. There are a couple of dimensions, maybe a few dimensions to that. I think the easiest to tackle is dates. Mahmud Zarghani was giving dates, actually, he dated each entry first with the Islamic date, like the 8th of Rajab or something, and then he would give the Gregorian date as far as he knew it. In many cases, definitely the majority of cases, he got this right. In many cases, as we see even in a prefatory note to Volume 1, the translation to it in English, he was off sometimes by a day, maybe two. In fewer cases than that, even more than just a couple of days. But this is understandable when we remember that he was pretty uninitiated when it came to the Gregorian calendar. He didn't have that much familiarity with it. So I think that can probably explain why some of those dates he was off here and there. Presumably the Islamic dates were right. I didn't check those because they were less applicable to this being an English translation of the book. But Sohrab, I would say, is more reliable in the dates for a couple of reasons. First and foremost is that he had been in America for much longer. In fact, I found a letter in the archives in Wilmette from Abul Fazl, Mirza Abul Fazl, to Ahmad Sohrab on the date of his arrival, his first arrival in America. It was, I think, April 25th, 1903. He was a very young man at the time. So he would have been in the West and had gotten familiar with the trappings of it, including the calendar, for about a decade. So that's, I think, enough time to really wrap your head around how the calendar works and to say the right dates. The other thing that he had going for him in notating these dates was that in many of the cases of these countries where Abdu'l-Baha traveled to, there were reports in newspapers and other objective sources, whether they were, non-Baha'i newspapers or they were Baha'is these early Baha'is who were writing their own accounts and diaries. And it's very easy to match those up against Zarghani or Sohrab and to find that no, Zarghani really was a day or two off and Sohrab seems to have been right. So a date is not really something to fudge or I think look askance at. I think that's pretty safe. And if you see something there, especially if you can triangulate it with other sources, then that's pretty easy. But as far as attributing words to the master or like a record of his events, that was definitely something I came up against too. And it's one of those things where I think you have to be a judge. You have to exercise your best judgment and to see if the things that I was going to say the words that Sohrab is basically putting in Abdu'l-Baha's mouth or is at least attributing to him, if they seem to square with and are consistent with everything else that we've read from Abdu'l-Baha, if it really sounds like him, because we do have so much that it's pretty easy, I think, to make an assessment like that, then I don't think there's a reason to really doubt it. For the most part, Sohrab was faithful. He hadn't defected yet, as you said. But if it starts to seem like there is a really new agey sort of airy-fairy quality to it, he did stylize is a verb I heard from somebody. He did have a way of kind of stylizing these words that he would attribute to Abdu'l-Baha. I remember coming across one, which is in the supplement because it coincides with this chronicle, but I'm pretty sure it's of dubious accuracy, and we don't have an original text for it as far as I know. He says something like, I commune with God every day and night, and he kisses my cheek, caresses my back, something like that. I'm like, I don't know how I feel about Abdu'l-Baha, the prospect of him actually having said things like this. It doesn't really sound like him. So that one maybe is a bit more suspect. But, again, if you find something from him and you can square it with some other report in Star of the West in English or definitely a Persian account like what you find in Mahmud's diary, really what I'm saying, the essence of it, it boils down to triangulation. If you can find other sources and square it up, if in the absence of that, you probably have to use your best judgment and think to yourself, well, of all this other material we have from Abdu'l-Baha, which a lot of it is authenticated, does it match up with those or does it raise a red flag? That's some very scattered and not very well laid out advice, but I hope it'll be useful nonetheless.
Sorry, I was on mute. Paula had a question first and then Josh. Thank you very much.
I just wanted not only to thank Adib for this wonderful presentation, but when I saw the pictures that you, not the pictures, but the things that you put up, and you were talking, and Abdu'l-Baha was there, and these children were lining the road, and they were lining the road all the way through the school. They're all like small children, and he's walking down, he's giving each one of them a gift. This is Christmas 1913. He's giving them gifts, and they're, mesmerized by who he is. Not that they understood completely, they were children, but to think this is 1 year before the outbreak of World War I. Abdu'l-Baha knew at that moment that all of these children would be involved.
I had never thought about that before, specifically with respect to World War I. But yeah, that's very sobering. What a great observation.
Yeah. I mean, he's there a year before this, so all the children that he met, and several times that you mentioned children, like when they call him Father of Christmas and all the different, in Stuttgart, and all the different places in Germany. Here he is walking in Germany, seeing all these children, and he knows full well what's coming. To me, that just catches me. Oh, thank you so much for showing us that.
You're welcome, and thank you for sharing that. That's great insight.
Thank you. Josh, you had a question? Thank you, Paula. Pauline.
Yes. Well, first, thank you, Adib, for this tremendous scholarly contribution. It's truly remarkable. I was wondering on your thoughts on kind of the celebrity of Abdu'l-Baha at this time, because wherever he went, he gathered so much attention, newspapers throughout Europe, then in America. And I'm just wondering how you think of this in relation to kind of the continued relative obscurity of the Baha'i faith. And I say that in the context of you can go to any of these places in Europe that Abdu'l-Baha visited, and you can ask the average person, do you know what the Baha'i faith is? And they just don't know. And so historically, though, it seems like this was an amazing event. Abdu'l-Baha's coming, it provoked this great attention, had this enormous effect and influence. Yet now when we learn history, when we look into the early 19th century before the war, nobody talks about Abdu'l-Baha. Although he was one of the most important Iranian intellectuals at the time, and far more interesting than Mirza Makam Khan and all the other ones. And that's why Baha'i scholars are shedding light on kind of the influence of Abdu'l-Baha's thought in the period. But why is he not remembered? What is the cause of this amnesia? Is there any hint of the ultimate cause of this very strange amnesia in world consciousness in the pages of this chronicle? Or is it altogether mysterious and unintelligible?
That is an excellent question, insightful, beautifully worded. I expect nothing less from you, Joshua John. Thank you for that. First of all, just by way of preface, for those of you who don't know, Joshua Hall is a very dear friend of mine. He very kindly agreed to read, I mentioned this in the foreword to the book, he read through a full draft, an early draft of the book, and offered many helpful comments. And also, as you may have seen in one of the last slides, offered his translation, superb metrical and rhymed translations of Persian poetry for use in the book. It is one of his many gifts, is his facile ability with understanding and translating Persian poetry. So thank you for that and for this, my spiritual brother. I appreciate it. Yeah, the question's a very good one because his celebrity is indeed documented amply. We have an excellent, in fact, it's not even one book. It's so large in range that we have 2 volumes by Amin Echea, a Spanish Baha'i scholar that George Ronald published called Apostle of Peace. And volume 1, I believe, is devoted mostly to the coverage Abdu'l-Baha received in America and maybe prior years. And then volume 2 is pretty much coincident with this book. It's right after the American journey, Europe and thereon afterwards. And we see, what kind of attention he had garnered, and the reporters were all over him, hovering around him like moths, Mahmoud Zarwani says in many cases. So yes, it definitely had generated a lot of interest. I wonder if Abdu'l-Baha knew, though, that the effect, it would be something of a delayed onset or a delayed effect, whatever the right phrase to use in that context would be. Basically that the results would not be immediate, because he often gives the analogy when leaving many of these places, I think including England and probably France, of the seed sower. And he actually quotes from Matthew the parable of sowing the seeds, or at least he alludes to it obliquely. And so I think he knew that this was just a first step. However, impactful it might have been in the very short term to generate a lot of buzz and get people very interested. Perhaps he was aware of what turned out to be fact, that it wouldn't last and that it may make time, it may take time for the faith to eventually reemerge. But the important thing was that the faith be planted there by the most capable possible hand, and that its influence would later exert itself. Perhaps the people, may have been outwardly receptive, but, inwardly, if they had been a bit more receptive, maybe willing to let go of status and what their family thought of them, they might have, full-throatedly embraced it. But one other aspect of Abdu'l-Baha's talks there, which I think are important, this applies both to his public talks and also his private audiences with the friends, is that in addition to generating interest among the non-Baha'is, it also served as an impetus to the friends to also redouble their efforts and serve even more. And I think we can see pretty amply in a new book, actually, that was, it was started by the late Adam Thorne, and then some other contributors, most notably Mujan Momen, brought it to fruition, I think late last year or earlier this year, The Baha'i Community of the British Isles. That is actually an excellent book, which if I had read it from cover to cover, I may have a definitive answer. I may have had a definitive answer to your question. Perhaps someone here has read it and they may have one. But I think that we would see that, there was that interest, and it just, it does seem, like you said, to have fizzled out. And perhaps it's just that he was priming people and sowing the seeds with the knowledge that it would not, that it would take some time for people to embrace the faith. And what we saw, actually, what we see in books like Mujan's and the other people who helped him with that book, is that the efforts of Abdu'l-Baha to really spread the faith there, it did result in a lot of people becoming Baha'is. So that definitely did, galvanize the masses. And I'm sure it probably led to the faith being passed down several generations. I bet a lot of those people from 100 years ago, the faith continued through their family, and their descendants are still Baha'is to this day. So I suppose we do see some effects. Yes, it may be a bit disappointing to see that, all of England did not embrace the faith. But then again, no country really did. I suppose it really is their loss, and I don't know what accounts for it. It's probably a variety of factors, but maybe some of that materialism and some of the physical and trivial concerns that was mentioned earlier, I think by Anne Perry on this call, those contributed. And the faith still is there. It has a presence. You're right. It's definitely subdued. It's more muted, but it is there. And I'm hopeful that when the time is right for it to reemerge, when the people are receptive to it, that it will make its grand reappearance on the stage. So that's all I, in my inexpert case, really have to offer here. So hopefully it's something.
Thank you. And I'll just make a quick cheeky comment with respect to the materialism of the Europeans, that there are some wonderfully delicious comments on Paris that you'll find in the volume. So hopefully that will instigate some more sales.
Yeah, I even remember in England, you're right, mostly the preponderance of it is in Paris, but also in England, he compares them to a lot of these materialists to cows. We've heard the comparison of a philosopher as cow before from Abdu'l-Baha, but this particular one about how they're like grazing in the field because their gaze is ever downcast, so they don't see anything around them. And I definitely thought that was amusing. I think some people might get rubbed the wrong way and have some feathers ruffled, but he was saying what needed to be said. It was the reality as he saw it. So,
thank you. Thanks, Josh. Shala, good evening. How are you?
Yes, thank you so much. Beautiful presentation. Very well. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have 2 or 3 little questions. One is that, do you know if there was any reason that Abdu'l-Baha traveled back and forth to different countries in Europe instead of sort of going from one to the other and then leaving? Was there a specific reason that happened because specific things were set up, or it just happened that they decided to do it that way? Because it seems to me very little bit unusual when you're putting together a trip. The other question I have, maybe we should go through one at a time.
I was going to say it might be just for both of our sakes and everyone else here to not keep it all in my head. Yeah, that's a great question. I had never thought about that question before, but I think I have a good idea as to the answer. Because the impression I get in reading the book personally is that as Abdu'l-Baha was in one country, either the friends, meaning the Baha'is, or non-Baha'is who had found out about Abdu'l-Baha, his presence in a nearby country, let's say these were people in Hungary and they knew that he was in England or that he was in France, which was just a hop, skip, and a jump away. They would write to him and they would really implore, sometimes more than once, could you please consider making a short visit to our country as well and speaking. So it definitely was not pre-planned. And Abdu'l-Baha talks about basically the impromptu nature of some of these trips. That it was really, I think you may actually remember now that I think about it, when I talked about Austria, it says to these two theosophists, remember, they're not even Baha'is at the time, and he says, you are the reason I have come here, because they had invited Abdu'l-Baha while he was in a nearby country. It may have been either Germany or Hungary, but basically on short notice, Abdu'l-Baha, in seeing the fervor and the potential, he decided to change course and say, we're not very far away, and these people are receptive. Maybe the seeds we sow here will not fall by the wayside and they'll be watered properly. So let's go for it, I think, to put it informally. So that's my impression. And he would say, and Mahmoud Zarghani would observe that these impromptu visits would also result in some delays with travel plans. So he would also have to be in touch with people in the East, like Haji Mirza Haydar Ali, and say that, the consequence of these things that I'm doing is that I'll be coming back later. And then ultimately, this whole experience really wore him out, frankly, physically. I mean, he was almost 70. So he ended up in Egypt, and that was supposed to be very short, but everybody pleaded with him, please take more time and rest. And that's why he was there for a good 5.5 months. And once again, I think it was only at the insistence of the people in the Holy Land, especially the members of his family. I believe Munir Khanum and Bahiya Khanum were specifically named. They said the people here really, 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 really want you to come back very ardently, very fervently. So please come back. Thank you. And then eventually he relented and he did come back. So that was probably a bit longer than you needed to hear, but I think that's the gist of it.
My other question is that in Montreal at the Baha'i Shrine, in the bedroom that Rui Khanum used when she was a child and lived in Montreal, we have a portrait of, told that it's one of two only studio taken photos, and it was taken in Paris. Do you have any idea if that is a truth to that? Whether or not it was in the first trip or the second trip that Abdu'l-Baha sat in a studio for that portrait?
Well, I've not been to Montreal, let alone, that site. So
you're very welcome.
Yeah. You're very kind.
We'll take you through the pilgrimage.
It would be a privilege. Because I have not seen that photo for myself where it hangs in that building, I can't speak to, that particular photo. But I do know that he did have at least one portrait photo taken in 1911, before the events in this chronicle took place. And I believe afterwards too, meaning the events in this chronicle in 1913, because Mahmoud Zarghani writes about that. And these can be found on the Baha'i Media Bank. They're freely available, very high resolution, and they're accompanied by dates. So anyone is free to look at that. And in fact, I see that the next person who has his hand raised is Jan Yashin, who of course is probably the most familiar with all things related to Abdu'l-Baha in France. So if he has anything to offer by way of correction or addition, I very much welcome it. But
the last question.
I didn't want to cut you off if you also had another question. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Is that when I was at Wilmette some years ago, I was told the story of how a lot of the papers of Ahmad Sohrab was discovered or given to the archive of US. And I don't know, most probably you have heard the story that a couple of Baha'is were sitting in a coffee shop and talking about the faith, and a young man came over and said, "Are you Baha'is?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, we are now selling the Historical Society building, and we have discovered some boxes of papers in the basement. Would the Baha'i community be interested in it? And they then called Wilmette, of course, the national office, and they said yes. And all those boxes were acquired, including, and these was, I suppose, and some original tablets of Abdu'l-Baha in Persian that Ahmad Sohrab had translated, but had given the English version to the people, but kept the Persian. I'm wondering if you have heard of this, and if you used any of those documents from the archive of Wilmette in Chicago to write your book.
So first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I don't think I'd heard it quite in that detail. All I knew, I think this is in the foreword to Robert Stockman's Baha'i Faith in America, Volume 2, which covers the early 20th century. I remember seeing something in the foreword there about how, I think in 1995, the U.S. Baha'i National Archives, U.S. National Baha'i Archives, rather, they came across this somehow, or at least they purchased the papers. But I think he kept it at that pretty high level, and I didn't know those details. So it's interesting, the sale of the New History Society building. Yeah, that makes sense, actually, that's where these documents would have been stored. That project was kind of his baby, even though it really characterized his defection from the faith and his insistence and his obstinance. But I definitely did use some items for this particular project, and I'm actually still using it for a current project. Where this project, the second volume of Mahmud's diary, is concerned, first and foremost, probably more than anything else, was the diary letters that I mentioned. These were letters that Ahmad Sohrab would write every night to a Canadian Baha'i, I think, living in New York City by the name of Harriet McGee. And those are all preserved in the diary collection. And this is something that I was given via email. The archives had already scanned this collection, presumably because they got it to me very quickly. And I basically just asked for the diary dates corresponding to all the dates in this chronicle, which would have been December 5th through December 5th, 1912 through December 7th or 8th, 1913. So a little more than a full year. And I went through every page of that hotel stationery, which probably amounts to about thousands of pages of hotel stationery. And anywhere where there were gaps to be filled in, I appended them mostly as endnotes to the book. In very, very, very few cases, footnotes. But mostly they're things that a person can refer to the back of the book and see, where I've tried to fill in some detail, lend some historical clarity to some subjects that Mahmoud Zarghani has brought up in his book. And really, I have to say, I mean, despite his very unfortunate and regrettable, in the form of a cautionary tale, really, demise of Ahmad Sohrab, at least he left this behind. There are a lot of gems in there. Of course, these diary letters have a lot of value, but I also found a lot of, when I was at the archives last year myself, I found a lot of correspondence relating to Mirza Abul Fazl in Persian. There was some correspondence between him and Eastern Baha'is, and also him and Western Baha'is. It works both ways. Both he was writing to them and vice versa, in Persian and less often in Arabic and in English. And English would have been through translations by somebody like Ali Ghori Khan, who was his interpreter during the 3 years that Abul Fazl was in America. He had been sent there by Abdu'l-Baha to neutralize the deleterious influence of Ibrahim Khairullah, as mentioned before. So really, his collection at the archives, it's very ample. There's a lot there. And I was only there for 5 days, and it was the tip of the iceberg. So there is much more to be found there, but I found literally hundreds of pages of documents pertaining to Abul Fazl, even transcripts in English, meaning Ali Ghori Khan had translated them, of lessons and talks and other sorts of things like that Abul Fazl would give to the believers there. I'm translating a biography of him right now that has been in existence for decades in Persian, but I'm hoping for a subsequent project that something can be done with those materials as well. So yes, all of that is to say that it's amazing. The collection is left behind. It is a gift, and I think that Baha'is will be mining it for gems for years and decades to come.
A final little anecdote about that historical society is that when they went to get the documents, they discovered the stone that Abdu'l-Baha sent from Palestine to be as the cornerstone of the temple. Apparently, Ahmad Sohrab had used it for a cornerstone of historical society, and that's why it did not appear. And of course, we got that beautiful stone that this woman offered to for the cornerstone. So that was the additional thing that I found interesting that happened with Ahmad Sohrab. I don't know, he seems to be a very complicated man in some ways, served Abdu'l-Baha, and yet I don't know if we will ever find out why and how the change happened, because I find that difficult to digest.
There were signs that were always there. He definitely was something. If egomaniac is too strong a word, then he was definitely an egotistical person, and you can see kind of a narcissistic. That's my pop psychology. I don't have a degree in psychology, but it strikes me as being narcissistic. Even when those days when he was writing the diary letters and he was, ostensibly faithful, he hadn't done anything contrary to the faith, really. But even in those diary letters, he before ever talking about the actual events of the day, certainly Abdu'l-Baha's words, starting to quote them, I think almost invariably he would preface his diary letters with these very long monologues. They were meant to be dialogues, but they read like monologues to Harriet McGee, his correspondent. And I don't know if it was maybe to show off his English or show that he was very smart or what it was, but he really just kind of waxed poetic and eloquent, and you nod your head as you're reading and say, this is pretty good, but you do it enough and it starts to look like a pattern. And I think eventually there is a story that I think it was Nellie French, who was an early American Baha'i. I heard this from Brent Poirier, another longtime Baha'i in the States. If I remember the details correctly, I hope. If I don't, someone please correct me if they happen to know it. But she was present when Ahmad Sohrab got the news that Abdu'l-Baha had ascended and Shoghi Effendi had become the guardian. He had acceded to that position. And apparently there was a kind of, unpalatable, color or emotion or something really kind of repugnant that kind of washed over his face. And then he said, I should have been appointed as the guardian. I am the one who spent years with Abdu'l-Baha, not Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi does not know Abdu'l-Baha as I have known Abdu'l-Baha, that sort of thing. So you can see these, that's where it really came to a head, but I think even years before that, you could see that streak. And then I've heard other stories long past that when, his recalcitrance really comes through and he thought he was kind of above the law. I think maybe his proximity to Abdu'l-Baha, maybe he arrogated to himself this right. He felt entitled to go outside the bounds and maybe not be subjected to review or not have to follow directives that were given from the guardian. And so there was that tense relationship. And eventually, as you all know, it came to a head and he defected and he really went full on into his new history society. It was a venture that he had started, and then he dies in the late 50s. And but his daughter was a Baha'i, and she lived to a long an advanced age, and I think 99 or 100. She passed away, I think, in the Houston area, maybe a year or two ago. But she didn't know him because her mother and Ahmad Sohrab had divorced when she was just an infant, I think. But anyway, this is more detail than you need. But yes, the story of Ahmad Sohrab is just really a cautionary tale. That's what I'll say, to put a button on that.
Thank you so much for that. I was thinking to add some things I had found out, but actually I think I'm going to save on that for time's sake. And Yan Yashun, welcome this evening. Hello, Apa from Paris. I lost you.
Jan, I think you're muted.
He's muted. Yeah, Yan, you're muted.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you very much for this fantastic presentation, your fantastic book, fantastic translations. And fantastic scholarship. But getting back to the issue of the demise, as you said, of the Baha'i community after the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, several points I'd like to raise. One is that before Abdu'l-Baha arrived in the West, there were thousands of articles already published. So people knew about the faith either directly or indirectly. So the faith was not something which came out of the dark. There was some groundwork had already been done. In England, with the work of E.G. Browne, and with France, in France, we had scholars like Nicolas Bobineau, Kazim Beck's translation, and other scholars. So there was a wealth of knowledge in certain circles. Anyway, the issue of the second point I'd like to raise is the impact of Abdu'l-Baha was not only on the Baha'is and on whether people would become Baha'is and would continue being Baha'is, but on the amelioration of society as a whole. Many people that he met changed or developed ideas or skills in conformity with the teaching, even though they didn't become Baha'is. And we really don't know the full impact of his teachings. That's an impossible thing to know how far the teachings of the faith spread in society. Nor do we really know how many people became believers who did not become part of the community. Being a Baha'i does not mean that you have to become part of the Baha'i community. You can be a believer and not become part of the community. So that is an unknown, and we have some proof of that phenomena existing. Now, about the demise, the biggest quake to the Baha'i community and to the ideals was World War I. We have very little research has been done on the trauma of World War I on the community, the European community as a whole, the Baha'i community as well. That was a tremendous trauma on society, and that has not been well explored. The trauma was that trauma of World War I and the loss of life and the horrors of the trench warfare and the starvation and all the grief of that went on. One of the repercussions of that was the collapse of France in 1940. We see the enthusiasm for various movements before World War I and World War II, like peace and theosophy, and just almost completely wiped out in the 1920s and 30s. They started to be revived, but not to the extent that they were before. So I mean, that's my take on that.
I really appreciate your lending your expertise to that question, Jan. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Thank you very much. So Nabil, Allahu Akbar, welcome with us tonight.
And thank you, Adib, for a very well researched and documented presentation. This is really wonderful. I just want to point out to a book that was written in Arabic by Professor Suhail Bashouri. This is a 430-page book, was published in 2011, and titled Abbas Effendi. It was not translated into English. Maybe that's your would be your next project, Adib. It would be a wonderful project to do. Because in it, he puts a lot of emphasis on Abdu'l-Baha's visits to Egypt, starting by the time when he was released from the Ottoman Empire and he was free to travel. The first country he traveled to was Egypt in 1910. And the total time of, actually he used Egypt as a center for his travels to Europe and North America. And the total time that he spent in Egypt was a year and a half, according to this documentation. So I just want to point this out, and I really would encourage you to look into this book, see if you can, I don't know if you know Arabic or not, but that would be a wonderful project for you as a young man and you have a lot of energy to do something like this.
Well, that's very kind of you to say, and I'm glad you reminded me of that book and you put it on everyone's radar here collectively. I have a copy of that book, actually. I've had it for a while, and that book, you're right about, at least to my knowledge, it's not been translated into English, but interestingly, it has been translated into Persian, and we have a copy of that book too. I think someone named Nahid Rouhani translated it. I don't remember the publisher, but I'm sure it can be found. I can read Arabic, and mostly where the writings are concerned is where I have the most level of comfort with that. Actually, that sort of classical Arabic. The more modern it gets, especially the more colloquial it gets, I struggle with it a bit more. But actually, Gamal Hassan, I don't know if he's still on this call, but he is certainly an expert. He may be the expert at this point, really, on the Baha'i community, really the history of the Baha'i faith in Egypt, I should say. I believe, if this isn't giving too much away, I think it's more or less public knowledge, he's writing a book on the subject. And I think it's in English, and I would be amazed if he's not drawing on that book, because it is well known, certainly to Arab Baha'is and others, as a key source for a lot of the information going in there. So if that's the case, you may well get your wish through the fulfillment of his project. But we'll just have to keep our eyes on that and see what happens. But thank you again for plugging that book. It was an excellent contribution left behind by Dr. Bouchri, God rest his soul.
So, Armin Jazari asked a question almost an hour ago in the chat.
Yeah, Jennifer, I wanted to say I'm not looking at the chat at all. I'm trying to field this question. So
I wanted to ask him, Armin, are you there? And he's in the list, but I'm not sure if he's there.
I am. I'm just listening in. It's so wonderful to be able to hear all the input from the participants as well as the presenter. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to know, sounds like a labor of love. I was just curious from beginning to end how long a project like this takes, and through some of the Q&A, some of the challenges that he faced or discussed. I was just curious about some of those challenges. I think he answered the second part of that question.
I'd be happy to answer the first part and lend a few more details to the second part. So as to how long it took, all in all, it was about 6 years. The first half of that was devoted exclusively, really, to the translation, the actual process of translation. And this would have been about... The original chronicle is about 375 pages long in the original. So I tried to be methodical about, X number of pages a day. It was, oftentimes it didn't even amount to one. Sometimes I'd have to content myself with half a page. But as the Persians say, "Qatre qatre jam gardad, vangahi darya shavad," you have drop by drop, and eventually they accumulate into an ocean, which is, I suppose, this great book that Mahmoud Zarghani has left us. So, or as Abdu'l-Baha loved to say, kam kam ruz beruz. I tried to keep that before me as a motto as I did this, knowing that it would hopefully, through his grace and confirmation, see the light of day. So it was 6 years all in all. The first 3 years of it was devoted to the actual process of translation. The latter 3 years to fine-tuning it, editing it, and doing what needed to be done in order to get the utterances and talks that are recorded in this book, those of Abdu'l-Baha, of course, approved. Because they all have the status of provisional translations, but in order for the book to be published, they had to undergo a review by the research department at the Baha'i World Center. And that in and of itself took about 9 months. And there was a lot of very helpful and valuable feedback they gave, and that was all incorporated. So a lot of those latter 3 years were spent on that process. And then other things besides, doing subsequent research, really, I guess, expanding the number of footnotes. There are probably too many at this point, but hopefully they'll be of some use. I think that more or less answers the first question maybe adequately. But the second part about challenges, it's a great question. It's one that I like to think about often. There are a few that come to mind beyond the ones that have been talked about on this call thus far. Really, the language itself was something. Mahmoud Zarghani writes in beautiful Persian, but it is, I don't mean this disparagingly, I mean it objectively. It's old-fashioned. Writing just becomes old-fashioned when 100 years go by. And he uses a lot of very ornate phrases, and the syntax is sometimes a bit tough to wrestle with. The sentences are very long. And so these are things that I had to really wrap my arms around and get a good taste and feel for early on. Even reading the handwriting, actually, a little bit. It wasn't his own handwriting. It was printed at an actual publishing house in Bombay or somewhere in India. But even that script that was used, it took a little bit of getting used to at first. So all of that, those were things to contend with. But, over time, you get a feel for someone's vocabulary, their style. Definitely having a dictionary, multiple dictionaries at my disposal, both from Persian to Persian and from Persian to English. Dictionaries of both varieties proved extremely helpful because oftentimes they would shed light on the real meaning of something Mahmoud Zarghani meant, or Abdu'l-Baha meant even. Language is dynamic, it changes. Shakespeare is an extreme example of this, but you find lots of words that are in his plays or sonnets and they're still in use today, but they don't mean the same thing at all. There's a gulf worth of change that has occurred between then and now, such as to change the meaning fundamentally and drastically. So there was some of that here too, maybe not to as drastic an extent, but it was kind of getting the lay of the land and realizing what is this text that I'm dealing with and how can I kind of overcome those hurdles. In addition to those lexicons and dictionaries, the two biggest aids that I can cite, of course, were my mother, who is credited on the book and thanked amply in the foreword. She's also present with us here today. Adib Masumian is her name. She very, very, very patiently spent more hours than I can possibly count checking every word of my translation against the original. So that has the benefit of a real native speaker behind it. I would translate roughly a page or two at a time, and then we'd review them together in installments and make changes as necessary. So that was the process behind that. And so in addition to the indispensable help she gave me, there was also a man by the name of Naim Nabil Akbar. He is the great grandson of Nabil Akbar, the apostle of Baha'u'llah. I have benefited immensely over the past maybe 15 years or so from his very priceless and skillful tutelage. We started out, he really schooled me in the Persian used in the writings and eventually some of the Arabic too. And we started out by reading the hidden words and then the Kitab-i-Iran. We worked our way up to more challenging texts, and it eventually culminated into having what I needed, being equipped sufficiently to take on this project. And I mentioned again about words changing and maybe having those nuances elude you inadvertently, unbeknownst to you. He was a big aid in, because of his immense grasp of Persian, he really knows the language like the back of his hand, whether of a classical variety or more contemporary and colloquial. He really rendered a lot of invaluable aid to me too. I would consult with him, and so he was a key collaborator in that respect too. So it just goes to show that it takes a village. All of this is to say nothing of the fact that I was dealing with literally unfamiliar territory. The subject was new to me. I encountered a lot of foreign names. I hadn't read very many of some of the existing accounts of what happened when Abdu'l-Baha was in Germany, what happened when Abdu'l-Baha was in France. It was a gradual process. It kind of came with the project. As I was working on it, in parallel, I had to educate myself on these things and also consult with a lot of the experts, for each of these countries. There were two people in Germany, two German Baha'is that I got in touch with. And with France, I didn't have to bother Jan Yashin, actually, because fortunately I had his wonderful tome. And I mentioned reading Ahmad Sohrab's notes in parallel with Mahmoud's chronicle. I also read this book. at least where chronologically relevant, in tandem with the book. And it was a key aid. And I think I cite him pretty often in the endnotes and maybe some footnotes for that reason. So like I said before, it really just takes a village. I mean, I may have kind of led the charge and it was under my supervision or something, but without the many people who helped in their own unique and indispensable ways, something of this size and substance and scope could not possibly have come to fruition. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into what went into it.
Adib, I have a question. When you worked in Germany, I had compiled actually from many different things, every transcript from Abdu'l-Baha's talks in Germany, but they're in German. I have made it a big document. It's 350, it's huge, but it's got all the stuff from all the people who wrote everything. And probably you already saw that Lisa Schwartz wrote every day, but sometimes her stuff conflicted with other people. And I don't know, but I didn't know about your project, to be honest with you. Otherwise, I would have shared that with you. But I had to do it for the Knobloch book also, to go through a lot of that. And yeah, I haven't seen your book yet because it's like.
I'm very glad you brought up your book, because Alma Knobloch and Fanny, her sister, are actually mentioned in the book, and they come up a few times, and there's some dialogue between Abdu'l-Baha and Alma Knobloch. But the timing of
Fanny in Paris, maybe also.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's possible.
1913.
That rings a bell. Yeah, that's right. And it was really good timing. I mean, really, it seems providential to me, subjectively, the timing of your book, because it came out, I don't know, maybe within a year of the release date. It was just enough time for me to get a copy, read through the parts that coincided with this book that I was working on, and to insert things in the endnotes that were relevant and really fleshed out some details. And there were lots of things like that. And so if you look in the endnotes, you will find your book quoted pretty often in there. I'm very, very happy that you undertook that. It was a great help.
I mean, I just think it's an amazing thing what happened in also Germany as well, because I know Janja, he's looking at the French side of the First World War, but the German side is also quite traumatic. And, you know, everybody kind of went into that war with the same stupid idea of winning. So, you know, and yeah.
They were all on the same page.
Thank you very much for that. I wanted to, Pauline had her hand up before, and then I told her I would take her after Armin. And I don't know if Pauline, are you still there? Because you had a question. I try to catch everybody. Pauline? Yay, there you are. I wanted to give you a chance to ask your question. I haven't forgotten you.
Not really a question. I was just going to contribute something that we were talking about. You know, it sounded like nothing really happened with all the places that Abdu'l-Baha went to visit. That, you know, we're talking about, you know, the leaves of the tree. We're talking about all the seeds that he planted. And out of all of this came the most wonderful thing for the Guardian, that Queen Maria of Romania came a Baha'i and spread the teachings. And that was Martha Root's influence. And her, I mean, there's a book called Early Believers of the West. She's in here, and along with many others. A lot of those people were part of those plants, seeds that were sown during that time between the First and Second World War that became Baha'is. But this, Abdu'l-Baha was there, of course, the year before, but between those two wars, there were so many people that remembered him. So there are books.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, there's already so much great literature out there, and we tend to forget it sometimes because there is just so much.
Alex, it's in Norway.
Very happy to see you, Alex.
Yes. Oh, yes. About but anyway, monumental work you've done. Thank you, really. And I was thinking about how in Islam, the tradition of Sunnah, you know, you follow what's told, these anecdotes about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and peace be upon him, and you try to incorporate that in your life, in the life of the community and so on in the Muslim community. And there's probably that's been there are many traditions, probably like anecdotes which have been shared in the Persian culture, Bahá'í culture, which it kind of emulates what happened in Islam, the importance of the Sunnah, which in the Bahá'í faith it has no importance really officially. The Pilgrim's Notes. So it would be interesting to me to the question I'm formulating in my mind is how this appearance of this book, which brings Abdu'l-Baha's life so much closer to us, how that will influence the Western culture, because in not a traditional society, so we don't live by tradition. We live in the same way, and perhaps most of the cultures in the world do live. How this kind of lore and these pilgrim notes might affect the they might. The effect of them in our Western culture and otherwise. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. It's one I was thinking about just the other day, so I was really hoping someone would ask it, and I'm very glad you did. I want to make an important distinction here, which is that yes, we do have an abundance of pilgrim notes for sure, which are people's personal impressions and recollections of Abdu'l-Baha, people who were there in his presence, but may have recorded things that he said. But those did not have the benefit of being verified by him for authenticity and accuracy. This book, my impression of it really, based on just what I've read from Mahmud Zarghani himself in the Chronicle, and also what the House seems to have affirmed, it seems to reinforce the impression I have, which is that this is actually an authentic record of his utterances and a reliable account of his travels. That's a paraphrase, but I think it's pretty close to the actual wording they use. And so for that reason, I think we actually can pretty reasonably rely on it for examples of how the perfect exemplar comported himself. It's seeing the perfect exemplar in action. And yes, we get some of that in Pilgrim's Notes, but people may have been projecting some of themselves into that. This kind of has, again, my understanding is the imprimatur, kind of maybe the seal of approval of Abdu'l-Baha. I think that's what makes Mahmud's diary so special, is he clearly did look at the account. Mahmud Zarghani presented him with it. And so he looked it over. And so I think we can be reasonably confident that the depictions of him, his behavior, his actions, and certainly the things that he said are, I would think they're heads and shoulders above just ordinary Pilgrim's Notes that were taken down in Persian. And what was actually recorded were the words of an interpreter, probably, who was present, somebody like Ahmad Sohrab or Amin Farid. So Lord knows how much of it was actually being colored by their own perceptions, two people who eventually defected from the faith. This, not only was it recorded in Persian originally, but it had, again, the benefit of being reviewed by the subject of the book, Abdu'l-Baha himself. So for that reason, I do think it's something of, and I'm not biased, because I'm the person who translated it, saying that I think it makes it a priceless contribution to the Baha'i world. It's just really objectively the case that what Mahmud Zarghani has done is really gifted us with something that has very little likeness or peer in the corpus of Baha'i literature. There's a testament actually to this from Abdu'l-Baha himself. I think I mention it in one of the last endnotes to the book, if I remember correctly. It's right around the time when Mahmud Zarghani is saying that I presented him with both the volumes of my account. I think there is an endnote there in which he says, or rather in which I wrote, that Ahmad Sohrab wrote in his diary around June 1914 that he witnessed this for himself, meaning he saw Mahmud Zarghani present Abdu'l-Baha with specifically this second volume of his account. And then he has some remarks from Abdu'l-Baha, again in English translation. He says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, "You've done very well to do this work. You have labored very much and greatly in undertaking it. When we first set out on this journey, no one was thinking to do this kind of work." I remember very clearly he said something to that effect. And so it really just goes to show you, in fact, what it proves to me is the benefit and importance of individual initiative. This was not something Mahmud Zarghani, I think, was asked to do, but it seemed to him that it would have great value priceless value for posterity to do it. And so he did it. And he did a superb job. Little trifling things like dates, those can all be corrected in the future, and they will be. But the bulk and substance of what he's done is enshrining, embodying, immortalizing the example of the perfect exemplar. And I think that is, without a doubt, through Abdu'l-Baha's words and his actions, that's what really shines through in this book. It teaches us how to behave with other people in ordinary or not so ordinary interactions, how to teach the faith to others, whether in a one-on-one conversation or to a larger audience, be they Baha'i or not Baha'i. These are just fleeting, cursory impressions of the person who translated it. But I mean, there's so much in this book. It's so multidimensional that I think anyone who reads it will come away with their own great insights of this legacy that Mahmoud Zarghani has left to the Baha'i world. So those are just some thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think I saw somebody had their hand up. Oh, Tahirzadeh, you had your hand up, I think, right?
Tahir, long time no see.
Wait here.
I just want to say to Adib, thank you so much for such a beautiful blending of East and West in bringing the faith to the friends in the Western world. This is one of the first times that we are having the original words of Abdu'l-Baha to a degree now being shared with the friends in English. It's so beautiful. It's very touching. I saw a couple of comments. One was about, if I'm right, because my hearing is not very good, but that how the Baha'i community spread afterwards and so on. I think the purpose of Abdu'l-Baha's visit to the Western world, in which he spent more than half of that time on the continent of Africa. I think we must never forget that. And that there was a reason for that as well. But the purpose of his visit to all of these places was to sow seeds. And on one occasion, when he was entering one of these countries, he mentioned to the believers who were with him that when you throw the seed on the ground, in some places it will immediately, what's the word, germinate. And it will blossom, it will grow and blossom. And in other places, it can be like throwing it on stone, and nothing appears to happen. And he said, we are now entering one of these places where the ground is very stony. And it will take years, perhaps even centuries, for the faith to be established in this country. But when it does, these people will become so strong and so devoted in their faith. And he promised that the majority of people in this country will embrace the faith of Baha'u'llah. And when they do, they will be absolutely firm and faithful than one can ever imagine. And he said to those who were sitting in the carriage with him in the train, he said, the only way that we can impart this to these people is through the way in which we carry ourselves, the way in which we behave. And that has more effect than anything else. So there are so many different things that happened on the trial. But God bless you, Adib. I'm so very touched to have actually acquired a copy of your book, and I've read some of it just now, some of it in these last few days. God bless you. Thank you for such a beautiful contribution to Baha'i literature.
Yeah, thank you. If I may add to that, Tahir, the redwood tree, it needs a fire so that the seeds germinate. The seeds don't germinate without fire. And maybe that's also going back to the wars when he said he came and then came a war to help things, germinate. Yeah. Yeah, and also the spiritual world is kind of outside time and space, right? So who knows? what that means, what he does. Yeah.
We hear the
Anyone
phrase.
has questions tonight they wanted to ask? Or Adib, you want to say something? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's that phrase I've heard before, in God's time. I don't know, somehow what you were saying reminded me of that.
Does anybody else have questions tonight? I think everybody's going to have to order the book, first of all. And then come back for more questions. Yeah.
It looks like we have one hand.
Does somebody just have a hand up? No. Yes, I'm clapping. Hi, Dinika.
Yes, hi, everybody. I'm flabbergasted by this brilliant presentation. I think such eloquence. I've hardly ever heard that. So thank you very much. I really want to read your book. And I'm in the Netherlands, so I want to know how I can buy it. But I will ask Jennifer. She will know the solution, I think.
Yeah.
And then I have a question. I heard a lecture of my father. He was also a Baha'i. And he held a lecture about the end of time in all the religions and all the prophecies that come to the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And he mentioned that Abdu'l-Baha was in Port Said, and there he met some Christians who were mocking about the Muslims. Can you tell me something about that speech of Abdu'l-Baha, or that meeting, or that conversation?
Yes. And this is something Gamal has probably also come across in his research. But yes, it's recounted. I'm surprised actually to hear you mention it. I had only seen it in Mahmud's diary and also Sohrab's diary. So maybe that's the source that was used in your case for that story. But as I remember it, yes, there were some missionaries. I think Sohrab says they were Baptist missionaries, which I thought was... or either Baptist or Catholic, one of those two. I know there's a big difference between the two, but it was one or the other. And they were there, and they had gotten into a conversation, probably more of an argument with Abdu'l-Baha, about Islam, really. And you're right, they were disparaging it, and I think Abdu'l-Baha, well, obviously he defends it, but what I remember him saying is something to the effect that these things that you have seen attributed to Islam and these people who outwardly profess to be Muslims and the way they act doesn't accord with the principles. This is not real Islam. You need to go straight to the source. You need to read the Quran and apprise yourself of its contents. Then you will know what Islam truly is about. And I believe there was a bit in that conversation about the Son of God, and about how they were taking great pride in the fact that Jesus is referred to as the Son of God. And actually, I don't want to mess that up or misremember it. So let me see if I can actually pull up in the PDF of the book that exact quote and read it for you. Let me see. Yes, yes, I found the page. So one of these visitors said the following: "It is said that in the gospel, Christ is the Son of God. This is the greatest description of him in the New Testament, but it is not mentioned in the Quran." The master replied, "In the dispensations of Moses and Christ, the Son of God was a term that applied even to the people of Israel, just as they are called the sons of God in the Torah. Towards the end of the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus," remember Abdu'l-Baha is doing this extemporaneously, but he could quote literally chapter and verse. 4th chapter of the book of Exodus, God says to Moses, "And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." End quote. Thus, if the people of Israel are referred to in the Torah as the sons of God, then what rank or distinction is there in Christ being called the Son of God? So I think he pulled out the rug from under them with that. And it's interesting how different impressions kind of lend color to the record of the event, because Zarghani then writes, Mahmoud Zarghani, he says, "The master's visitors were rendered speechless and totally astounded by the power of his utterance and the strength of his proofs." And then he says some more things in that vein. But what I found in Sohrab's diary, which records the same event, is Sohrab describes their departure rather differently. He says, "They left Abdu'l-Baha's presence quite confused and displeased because they did not expect such an overwhelming power, knowledge, love, and radiant influence. So it helps to get different multiple perspectives. I think you get different dimensions. I think both of those things can be true at the same time, but it's very interesting that we have these multiple eyewitness accounts. So I think that's what you were referring to.
Oh yeah, and it's wonderful to hear it again. And
Yeah.
I'm
I also really
proud
enjoyed
of
that
my
now.
father that he knew those kind of things. I think, whoa,
Oh,
how could he find out? Yeah,
it
he's
is
not
the mystery of
living
God.
anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
Alex, hello.
This is just such a rich discussion, and it just occurred to me about what is the voice of Mahmoud Zarqani, and I'm trying to compare it to the voice of Nabila Akbar. Excuse me, Nabila Azam. The author of the Dawnbreakers. Of course, they can't really be compared. But my question is anyway that how do you what's your impression of his voice and where is he speaking from in a way?
Well, they can't be compared on. I get what your question is, but just to give that caveat. Yeah, they can't be compared on a couple of different levels. First of all, because Nabil was setting out to write a history of the Bahá'í religion up to the time of Baha'u'llah, and so it was totally different subject matter in one sense, and he needed to approach that with a certain eye. And also, we can't really evaluate compare the two, because we also don't have access to the original narrative, Nabil's narrative for the most part. Shoghi Effendi, I've seen the verb recreated be used. I think on Baha'i.org, that's actually the verb that they used. And maybe they took that from something Ruhi Khanum wrote in The Priceless Pearl. I'm not sure. But it is a much more apt word than just a translation as far as describing what Shoghi Effendi did with Nabil's original narrative. Because there are a few pages of the original floating around here and there. And when you compare them to what Shoghi Effendi did, he really did reshape the book in a way that was very well suited to the Western temperament. It really reads something of like a stirring gospel to, animate the friends and get them in touch with their spiritual heritage, that sort of thing. So it is a different matter altogether. But no, the question nonetheless is still very valid as a chronicler, because that's what Nabil was. Nabil Zarqani was a chronicler. He was something of a historian, or he was asked to be historian in that moment by Baha'u'llah. And Mahmoud Zarqani, again, unsolicited, unasked, he went and undertook this. But really the sense you get is he was just a devoted lover and servant of Abdu'l-Baha. I mean, it is filled with effusive admiration for the master. The impressions of Abdu'l-Baha's talks and sort of the receptions he was accorded by private individuals and at larger public spaces, it all just is, it serves to it really redounds to the grandeur of the faith and that of Abdu'l-Baha. It shows what a tremendous effect his being there had, on the climate and on the hearts and souls of the people with whom he spoke. So it really is just an admirer, a lover of Abdu'l-Baha, witnessing the things that really, he was recording the things that he was witnessing, and that comes through his real dedication and devotion and loyalty, frankly, to the master. It actually makes for an interesting contrast with some of the nuances of Sohrab's diary letters that we were talking about, where Sohrab tended, in the beginning of each of his letters, for the most part, he would insert himself a lot by way of preface before he actually got to the real heart of the matter. Mahmoud Zarqani basically never does that. He always immediately starts talking about, the master in a way that is focused on him and really just tends to focus on activities. I can think of 2 or maybe 3 instances in which he recalled something. He'd say, I remember a time, or this event reminded me of something that happened when we were in America, or when I was still in Iran, or even in India, I think, because Mahmoud Zarqani is very well known to Indian Baha'is. He spent a lot of his life there. Not so much to American or even Iranian Baha'is. But he wouldn't insert himself to a disproportionate, an unseemly degree. And when he did it, the number of times you can count on one hand, it was really just to serve the larger point that he was making. It was usually just subsequent to something from Abdu'l-Baha that he had quoted. And it was just meant to reinforce what he said. So you really just see someone who, if he could have sacrificed himself for Abdu'l-Baha, he probably would have unhesitatingly. That's the impression that comes across for me. There was another thing I was going to say about his. Oh, yes. He also depicts really, I think, the human dimension of Abdu'l-Baha, because after all, he was occupying a physical body and he got sick. We saw, he had to contend with what looked like a lingering, protracted cold for several months. And you get some insight into how he dealt with that, and he'd have to interact with doctors and be prescribed. I think one of them prescribed carrot juice and different kinds of things. And so you do get the quotidian stuff, the day-to-day, the mundane. And Mahmoud Zarghani would offer impressions, like especially after talking to some of the friends in Paris on at least one or two occasions that I can remember right now, when, he was lamenting their hedonism and preoccupation with materialism, those sorts of things. Mahmoud Zarghani would end the entry that night by saying the master's heart was very heavy that night. He was visibly despondent. And, of course, those are the personal impressions of a Baha'i who was in his presence. But I like to think that he had spent enough time with him at that point that he did have a pretty good handle on what Abdu'l-Baha's emotions were. And to me, it almost, because he's our perfect exemplar, maybe this is a silly way of putting it, but it almost gives you permission, from my perspective, to feel that way every now and then. I think, to have a very natural reaction in the face of what seems to be insurmountable obstacles is at first to, be a little sad and upset by what you're seeing around you. But the point at the end of the day is that you get up and you continue, and he pressed on with what he was doing. And I think we can take a lot of heart and we're in that and follow his illustrious example. So those are some thoughts on those questions.
Thank you. Dear Adib, somebody asked in the chat to me, if you could share the page number of the story you shared in Egypt, or in Abdul.
Yes, absolutely.
In the book that was.
Certainly, yes. So I'm on the end note right now, so let me go back to where the story was. It's on pages 481 to 482.
481 to 482. Okay, great.
Yeah. So toward the end of the chronicle itself, because it was in Egypt, which was around the end.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank you very, very much. Shala, did you have one more question?
Yes, I just want to thank you for mentioning about Abdu'l-Baha catching a cold and still carrying on, because the same thing happened when he came to Canada. He got sick, but he spoke morning, afternoon, and evening. He was so it's fact that he would get up and get on with it no matter what. And it's such a good lesson. And I'm so glad you mentioned it. I'm wondering if you have mentioned it in your book, because it's a good thing to remember that we all will have those moments that you wake up and you're not in perfect shape, but that doesn't mean that you can't get on with it. Thank you for that.
Sure. It is definitely mentioned in the book, because Mahmoud Zarghani mentions it in the original book on several days, where sometimes he was too sick to even receive visitors when it was particularly bad. But other times he would receive a private audience, or if he could manage it, he would still go and, whether to a hotel or some other grand hall, and speak. I think I gave one really illustrative example of this, actually, when Abdu'l-Baha was in Vienna and he had to speak to the Theosophical Society. And I think he was still lingering, rather, he was contending with the lingering after effects of that protracted cold. But even in spite of that, he had basically spoken morning, midday, and night, like you were saying, and it was the evening at this point. He had already completely exhausted himself, but nonetheless, he went up those 120 steps, which I happened to find a tablet right before the book came out, and I included it, where he describes those steps as being cold as ice. And if we've seen Abdu'l-Baha shoes in the International Archives buildings, we know that they're very delicate. He probably could, he mentioned that detail presumably because he felt it through his shoes, is my impression. And so having to contend with that too, ascend those 120 steps, and then speak for 2 hours accompanied by a comprehensive, it's superhuman is the only word that I can think of. He did what his body allowed him to do, but sometimes it just seems to me that he could even transcend his limitations. We ordinary humans have adrenaline rushes, but he seemed to have that on steroids, like to an accelerated degree or something. Because it's to a degree that we can't fathom, because he was the mystery of God. So yes, to answer your question, there are definitely some insights into his sicknesses and what he had to deal with, but with the core message that he still pressed on to the extent that he could in every case.
At Vienna, then he came back to Germany, and he was so sick that Germany was asked not to publicize his talks, but they did anyway. And then there were 600 people waiting. And then as a result of that, he said he's not going to come. He's not going to talk. And he said, and he actually refused. And then they went there and they saw how many people were there, and they went back, and Council Schwarz begs him, please come, please come. And Jacques said, you come? And he says, I'm really sick, look at me. And then there's a moment, Baha walks in the room, and it's really dramatic. And he does go and give a talk, but he says, I can't one person, do this for me. Zabina, you had a question?
I wanted to add very quickly. I'm glad you brought that up, Jennifer, because there's a part actually in his, I guess it was his return to Germany, like you were saying, or maybe that was the initial trip, but this was the return following Hungary and Austria. It's on page, this is on page 346, where Mahmoud Zarghani writes, the friends expressed their gratitude for the master's stay, meaning in Stuttgart specifically. And Abdu'l-Baha replied, the believers here are worthy. I am now sick with a cold and a fever, and you all have benefited from this turn of events. And I thought that was amusing, that, they really wanted him to be there that badly. And I said, well, I'm sick, and now you have me, so. And they all laughed.
He said he was only going to stay for 6 days or something, and then it was longer,
He prolonged it, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry, I'm not in Germany anymore, but it brings back on. Okay, Zabina, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out. No, I lowered your hand and then you disappeared, and I was like, wait, come back.
Being born in Germany and hearing, which, by the way, I'm just absolutely stunned about the brilliance of your presentation, and can hardly wait to get it. And so I was so pleased what you said, what Abdu'l-Baha said, Germans. And so it kind of, I found especially inspired. And, sometimes we get a little bit into statistics and come across a little bit over phonetic in our approach. And I hear it even on my end, right? Oh, that's because you're German. And I'm going, when I hear you mention about Abdu'l-Baha's comments about the Germans, I felt really kind of very happy. Thank you ever so much, Adib. Thank you. Absolutely brilliant.
I appreciate your saying that, Zabina. And you will see ample evidence of that when you hopefully get the book. I mean, in Germany itself, he's very unrestrained with his praise, but especially in the subsequent trips when he goes to Hungary and Austria, I think back to France, he has many an occasion to speak very glowingly about the Baha'is of Germany. I can think of probably 6 or 7 instances offhand right now. So yeah, you will really get a kick out of those, is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Pauline?
Well, I just wanted to say about Germany is that if anybody's been to Langenheim, you don't have to ask any more questions.
Because they had 60th anniversary last week.
I tell you, all I can remember is Frau Kruger when I was there. It was wonderful. And you could put blueberries in the path in the back. All seeds from Abdu'l-Baha.
Okay, dear friends, I think this has come to the end of our evening. It was really a pleasure to have you here, Adib, and I'm really thankful for your work and your book and all of those things that you have put together and all of your efforts, and also the time that you spent with us this evening on the other side of the hemisphere, right, on the European side, African side also, I think. And I really thank you for everything. And maybe as you start to get more distribution locations, especially for Europe and Africa and over on this side, with my with the invitations, I don't mind if I have an invitation and at the bottom I might put some things Tom Price had asked me to add about his words project, and I added that. And so I add, after the invitation from Joe, I'll put some kind of things that people might also be interested in to just get the word out, because the distribution list is quite long by now. And that brings me to next week. And I wanted to say that this is super special thing for me. In 2013, I was doing research in the archives in Washington, and I had the pleasure of, right before taking off my plane to visit Hoda Mahmoudi, who's the chair of at the University of Maryland Peace Chair, Baha'i Peace Chair. And we were talking, and I said, somebody's got to write a book on Susan Moody, and so on and so on. And so she did it, and this year it has come out with Routledge, which is academic press, because she is in academia. And next week, on the 18th of July, is the 100th year anniversary of the murder of the U.S. Ambassador, so to say, at the time, consul. He was representing the United States in Iran, and he had become close friends with Susan Moody, and the wild crowd seemed to think that he was Baha'i, or maybe he was. I don't know what she found out. And she's going to present this next week, and also her research on Susan Moody, which is, of course, for all of us Baha'is, extremely relevant, because Susan Moody went to Iran as a gynecologist in 1907, and this was like an economic development project that Abdu'l-Baha sent her there, and they started hospitals, and of course then the Tarbiyat school and other things. And it was a very, it started that Abdu'l-Baha had said, you know, so many people like Mirza Abu Fazl and so on sacrificed so much to come and bring spiritual truth to the West. And now it was the West's turn to repay that with material help to the East. And this is the beginning of many projects. And now we're doing book 13 and 14 and trying to figure out how to do economic projects even in our own neighborhoods. So I think it'll be a fascinating show next weekend, next Thursday. And then we will have a break until August 9th, which is a Friday, okay? But I'll talk about that again next week. He's the who was able to bend my rule Thursday night. But after 2 years of trying to get Chris Anderson to come tell us what's going on in Rwanda, I just said I'd take what I could get. So anyway, it will be this next week, and then there'll be a break until the 9th of August. And Adib, really thank you deeply for your time this evening, and I wish you all the success with your book. And I have you come back again, and finally somebody present Mirza Abu Fazl. I'm so happy about that. You know, I really would be extremely grateful. Yeah, the whole Western world, since he's the father. Okay, everybody.
Yep. So excited about Dr. Susan Moody, because I just accidentally discovered she had come to Seattle. So I'm